Probably not. Hi. I just like went to do something and my screen was like, I'm gonna need like a.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out.
Awesome. You're like already making connections. Man, I didn't get a chance to put on lipstick today. Either.
I'll have you help me. How about that? Okay. Can we, let's see, where's your delete button? Oh, you gotta enable content. Okay. Okay, let's delete. Delete. Okay. Okay, delete this one. Delete.
But we can put our names on the podium. Okay. For the video. Okay.
Wonderful.
I'm so glad you could come. And I know that it's a stretch for you since you have to travel this afternoon. You know each other. Tara.
Kimberly Reed, nice to see you.
I've been moved to the,
Okay, I have to see my wonderful
I'm gonna move this in a minute now. You're leaving for somewhere?
Chicago.
Oh, my goodness.
So that's-
What do you?
I'm doing a lot of meetings this week. So Chicago, New York. So
You're based
here in DC. Yes, I'm with the International Food Information Council.
right. Do you have your card?
I
would
do.
love to be in touch and let you know what I'm doing on food. And I'm sure you know the Global Council in Chicago.
Yes.
Dan Flick.
Yes.
All those
I was sorry to miss, they had a big event here last week. I was very sorry to miss
Me
it.
too, but it's just hard to be everywhere. Thanks so much. Yeah, it is hard to be everywhere.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Kimberly
Paul Rockow.
Reed.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So both of you traveling today. Let's hope airlines are on schedule.
Inshallah. Where are you headed?
Chicago.
Okay.
How about you?
Zimbabwe.
Excellent.
So Paul, who are you working for these days?
Well, I work for myself in Levantine Public
Right.
Diplomacy. That program in Zimbabwe is through Levantine PD. That's with the U.S. Embassy and the Harare International Festival of the Arts. I also work with Next Level, which is a hip-hop diplomacy program through
Yep,
UNC and the State Department. Was just running a global global hip-hop exchange.
You know who just asked me? I don't know if he's here. Craig.
Craig, yeah.
Can he do something with you?
We've talked.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I shouldn't
Yeah.
assume that you hadn't. So.
Yeah, no, I saw him a couple weeks ago, and we actually just had a program here at AU, which he
I
helped.
mean, the truth is, it's not easy to make money in the PD field.
Yes.
You have to have a project with funding. Is that, a fair?
That's fair. I mean, it helps that I have the Next Level program that's
Right,
steady.
ongoing,
And then, yeah,
right.
and then the projects I get to do on my own through Levantine PD.
Yeah. And I'd be
Easy.
happy to do some with one of your projects. I mean, I'm doing now consulting to 4 different PD-related GW, World Learning,
Mm-hmm. Oh, terrific.
which is a big one, and that's been fun. A new program called Womanity, which is women
Okay.
as humanity, and it's out of Switzerland, and they're
Okay.
doing, and then obviously Mark Donfried and those. So, but I need to tell him is that you get a little money here or there, but it's
Yeah. I mean,
slim pickings.
my business model works because I have zero overhead and live on the road.
And mine is zero overhead, and
Yeah.
I have a university connection, which
Yeah.
so
Ain't easy.
yeah, it really isn't, and
But
know.
I was talking to Craig about it, but there is also this void of like a firm that handles public diplomacy and best practices and the consulting side of
because
it.
it's folded a lot into PR and
Yeah.
communications and strategy. And, I think once again, the BBG is going through its cleansing of what
Cleansing.
is. And, State Department tonight is this, they're doing a food diplomacy thing,
Okay.
but it's completely out of. Yeah, all that. So,
Sun and shine. Is that
yeah, that's it.
sun and shine? I like
Yeah. Thank you. Sonnenschein, German origins. No problem.
Rock hour. Rock. Yeah. Yeah. Levantine public diplomacy.
Like if you see that they're
rock hour.
Okay.
What I'm gonna do is put Sam between you, because he's commenting on something you said.
Okay. Okay.
That's what Johanna tells me.
Okay. Sounds fine by me. Okay.
No, I'm going to use about 3 because no one wants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep my remarks.
I'm going to keep it very brief.
Then what we'll do is do Q&A, but I've gotta get out of here.
Well, and I have to leave at 11:30, so we're all.
I'm on my way to Zimbabwe.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind just saying, I know one of our panelists is getting up, as I get up, has to go teach about this, so,
Wind up the whole thing.
yeah, I think it's a little long for an hour, Yeah,
Okay. So we'll keep it tight.
yeah, I'm gonna keep mine, I'm cutting as we speak.
If we end the panel presentations early, then we got plenty of Q&A, so that's.
Okay. Yeah.
And we're gonna be showing a video, so the possibility of things screwing up is just enormous.
Okay. So then we'll all keep it brief. I mean, nobody ever complains at brevity.
No, exactly.
Mic's already live.
Okay.
So it's streaming. Just,
Oh, good.
From now,
Oh.
so.
Hi,
Yay, hot
streaming.
mics.
I'm streaming.
Hello, hot mic.
Now they all know we're gonna try to start the show.
Here, Gary, I'll give you. Hi, how you doing?
Hi, I'm with volunteers. I just want to make sure everyone knows that you guys know it's being live streamed, right?
Yes, and we heard that the mics are already live.
Okay.
Yes.
That was
Okay, thank you. Kimberly Reed, nice to see you.
the interest of transparency.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that.
It's 10 minutes after 10, and I've grown up with Hora Latina, so if we need 10 minutes to chat Hora Latina.
It should start working.
Well, thank you, Joanna, and thank you. I think you're right to get started. This is a university campus that has lasted change, and people come to come in and say hello. And when Joanna called me about delivering a few brief welcoming remarks, a few vivid memories raced through my own mind. A couple of words for you and about today's conference and Cuisine as a point of entry for discussion about global issues. I love the concept of this course that she teaches here, and one of the memories that came to mind was my own 2-year-old daughter when she sat in her high chair grabbing the last bits of my homemade macaroni and meatballs and joyfully exclaimed, "I love food." And I remember that, and my 87-year-old Italian immigrant father was witness to this delicious moment, and he put his hands together in prayerful thanksgiving to the Lord, and as if to say, my work here is done. And so as a child and grandchild of immigrants who came to the U.S. and opened a small Italian grocery store and a neighborhood Neapolitan pizzeria, I really do understand the concept of a food culture, or gastro-diplomacy as it's called now, and the use of food as a symbol of national identity, as well as a tool to assimilate into an adopted country. We were part of a large ethnic diaspora in Connecticut, many who left their homeland not for reasons of conflict, but reasons of poverty. And I can identify with that aspect of creating a full food culture that Joanna teaches here in this course in conflict cuisine. But I also had the memory of moving here to Washington in 1981. I couldn't find decent Italian food, but I quickly became acquainted with exotic restaurants that featured the cuisines of other cultures and immigrants to this area. Restaurants such as Vietnam in Georgetown, or Mama Aisha's Afghan restaurant in Cleveland Park, the Red Sea El Tamarindo, and also Omega, the El Salvadoran and Cuban restaurants in Adams Morgan as well. All of those are countries and populations that had seen their share of conflict and resulting migration. These were the culinary diplomats who used action-forcing events in their countries to create traditions that are now part of our culinary destiny. And much tool of diplomacy, quite literally a delicious use of soft power through the art of culinary diplomacy. For example, in the planning of state dinners for foreign heads of state, we were eager to showcase our food culture and cuisine while also giving a nod to the cuisine culture of our foreign guest by utilizing a guest chef or incorporating a symbol of our guest's national identity into the menu. But during those years, I also saw the nexus between food and disease, and food and conflict. In my travels to nearly 70 countries, including many post-conflict nations in the Middle East, Central America, Africa, and South Central Asia, I saw firsthand how the ravages of war and the resulting food insecurity are such a great threat to sustainable development. Even in the poorest countries, however, hardest hit by the most challenging circumstances, our foreign hosts were always eager to share their culture through their food and offer whatever they have on their table as a tool of communication about their way of life. I can distinctly remember tasting the juice of pomegranates in Afghanistan or cassava in Liberia. And I definitely have vivid recollections of being offered a warm, fermented goat's milk when sitting in a yurt in 18-degree Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. That drink might have a hard time finding a place on a menu here at home, and certainly it was far less appealing to me than the pisco sours I was offered in Peru. But they all had the same effect. They told a story about how food is essential to understanding how people relate to each other. That's why this conference is so exciting. And the panel experts that you will hear from today will share their knowledge on this all-important topic of food and what we can learn about history, culture, and conflict by examining simply life around the table. This summer I'll be traveling to Milan to the Expo. You'll hear a lot about that from others that are here as part of my role as chair of the Grants and Scholarship Committee of the National Italian American Foundation. We're helping to support our U.S. pavilion by introducing the concept of the Mediterranean diet as a healthy diet. So thank you for inviting me to share a few minutes at this morning's opening session. I was really delighted to hear from you, Joanna, and thanks to Paul Johnson, who recommended me. So enjoy the conference. It's a great day for food. Bye.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. First, I want to thank Anita for joining us this morning. She certainly is someone who has been a culinary diplomat, even if she didn't realize it firsthand. So I really appreciate your spending a few minutes with us this morning. I don't know if you know that American University has an executive in residence program, and we are very lucky to have Anita as one of those who spends her time very generously with the university. So it is a good day for not only us here at this conference, but for the university. As you know, I'm Johanna Mendelsohn Foreman, and some people say I was crazy to give up my field in foreign policy, dealing with post-conflicts and wars to deal with this. But actually, today we have a question we want to answer, and that is the kitchen the new venue of foreign policy? I have come on this journey over 2 years thanks to many friends who I will mention, some of whom are here on the panel. But I wanted to just tell you a little bit about this conference and what we're trying to do today to set the tone for many of the things that you will hear over the course of the next few hours. My own earliest memories of conflict cuisine came from hearing stories told to me as a young woman. Sitting in my mother's kitchen in New York, I heard tales of many women who had come to the United States to escape the Nazis. Most enduring of those stories was the memory of the foods of their homelands, the chocolate cakes of Hungary, the butter cookies of Austria, the desserts of Vienna. My mother, a wonderful cook and writer, was also the American, so she became the translator of recipes for this generation of women. While all of these friends told harrowing stories of their journey to America, they also carried their culinary baggage in the form of memories of their own family meals, their holidays, their own recipes, especially for sweets, it turns out, look at me, and their their desire to have these talks memorialized in English. Little did I realize that I was actually learning about the principles of conflict cuisine. And so my curiosity about the relationship between war and food began. Today we know that food's relationship to conflict is complex and multidimensional. But it is only recently that the world of food, humanitarian, development, agriculture, and diplomatic, have become a part of a larger inquiry about how food is both a tool to communicate culture, but also central to the impact that conflicts have on civilians. It is neither anthropology, nor history, nor development, nor economics, but a field that is emerging as an interdisciplinary approach to the nexus of food and war. There is no doubt about the centrality of hunger in war, but we have learned from recent times that rebuilding states after the fighting stops stimulates innovation, trade, and resilience by survivors who rebuild their farms, their communities, and their lives. Food also connects people who flee their homelands. Food becomes a form of memory. the taste of home, the memory of a dinner with a loved one. The ingredients that make for a national dish are all evocative of the ways in which food enters the body and the imagination. This conference will reflect on 3 different ways foods affect conflict and how it becomes a tool of foreign policy as a form of soft power. Ironically, it's the hard power of states and rebel groups that leads us to this conversation about food. But today we set out on a journey to look at food through the lens of diplomacy, conflict resolution, peace building, and national identity. Sure, there are other dimensions of food that we could address and are equally important: food security, humanitarian assistance, agricultural production, nutrition, food waste, and more. But with limited time, I thought we could start with those aspects of food to literally whet our appetite to other themes. And I hope you'll be staying for lunch because it's really worthwhile. My course, Conflict Cuisines, War and Peace Around the Dinner Table, looks at diasporas who've come to Washington, D.C., not only to make new lives, but to make new friends through their kitchens. Immigrants who have been displaced by the conflicts of the Cold War to those who have arrived more recently all have in common the desire to succeed in a new country through the use of their respective cuisine to feed their own compatriots, but also for those of us who live here. Food is a tool of economic resilience. It may be hard to learn English immediately, but it's possible to cook, to open a restaurant, to help support one's family. My goal when I first conceived of this project was to have students learn about the war's past and ongoing conflicts, to seek out the histories of these events, but also to put these conflicts into a more accessible format by meeting restaurateurs, interviewing immigrant chefs and entrepreneurs, and actually tasting the cuisines. Yes, my class goes to 4 dinners in 4 different restaurants. I also wanted to see whether this course could become a template for use by other schools around the country. What better way of building understanding in a community than by actually meeting those who have newly arrived and share their culture through the kitchen? We start today's program with a conversation about culinary diplomacy. One of the oldest forms of foreign policy, it is the use of food to persuade, to cajole, and to convince. It goes back to ancient history. Even though the French claimed to be the inventors of this type of diplomacy, and Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius made this declaration on Twitter, causing much ado in the diplomatic world, the practice of hosting dinners with national leaders for political ends has much deeper roots. From biblical times, the Last Supper, from political ends that have deeper roots, to the Renaissance in Italy and beyond. In the United States, culinary diplomacy also gained greater notoriety. In 2012, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton inaugurated the American Chef's Corps to demonstrate our nation's culinary prowess and showcase our best chefs. So many of them themselves were immigrants to other nations. A more recent area of this type of diplomacy is what we now call gastro-diplomacy, or what I think of as people-to-people eating. Food trucks, market stands, and more. The rise of food blogs, the TV chefs that travel the world to become the new interlocutors with communities around a dining table, all attest to the growing awareness of the role food can play in letting down one's guard and speaking truth to power. Some may even conclude that chefs have become the most trusted individuals. We know politicians are not these days. If you are willing to eat what someone has cooked that you have never met before, you are demonstrating a high degree of trust in eating that food. If diplomacy fails, what role will food play in conflict? This is the subject of our second panel. Our talented speakers will provide you with illuminating stories on the ways in which food has been used to build peace, to win hearts and mind, and to build economic resilience with immigrants. The flip side of this issue, whether food drives conflicts, will also be explored. As we know, climate change, environmental degradation, and warfare all threaten agriculture and thus impact lives. Refugees outside of Syria now comprise 1/3 of that country's population, creating one of the greatest humanitarian feeding problems that the United Nations World Food Program faces. Yet food can also be seen as a form of resilience. Just watch videos of Syrian women in camps preparing recipes from the food they get from vouchers from the World Food Program. Adaptability and innovation are all part of a discussion about food, conflict, and connection of both. Conflict cuisines have been a feature of Washington's restaurant scenes for decades. I can recall how the old Washington refrain telling where you could be at war by looking at the restaurants that opened, and this is really true, was evident with each new ethnic cuisine that emerged in our city. Today, the changes in our immigration policies have constrained this part of our culinary scene. Tim Carman of the Washington Post, who'll join us later, who has ably documented the, quote, cheap eats of our city, has also become the unofficial culinary ambassador of ethnic food. He will be interviewing some local chefs, not the big names, but people who cook and teach others, about how they view these international foods in the midst of a Washington high-end restaurants. Nations have recently discovered that food can be the perfect hook to elevating their standing in a world of competing economic interests. Middle powers like Peru and Mexico have taken advantage of their great cuisines and their chefs to promote food to the pinnacle of their national brand. Today, Peru is the #1 culinary destination according to Travel and Leisure magazine. Thanks to the work of UNESCO, which deems certain cuisines intangible world cultural heritages, we see how food becomes something that we must not only eat to survive, but also to consume to celebrate the best of a culture. So why hasn't the United States been a party to the Intangible Cultural Heritage Treaty? You'll get to ask one of our former ambassadors. Food is also a powerful tool of chefs who want to use their skills to help people in need. The work of programs like World Central Kitchen underscore the way modern chefs like Jose Andres and his team can give food and comfort in places like Haiti. They can become the face of education about food when chefs combine their skills to help eliminate food waste and manage food deserts. Culinary tourism, nation branding, and food as a way to provide relief are all considered in this last panel. But finally, a conference on food would not be complete unless we talked about food memories. What do people remember about their past? The Kitchen Sisters have been regaling us for years with their stories of hidden kitchens on National Public Radio. We end this meeting with a conversation with Nikki Silva about what she has learned from the conversations we have held today as a way to expand our understanding of two subjects that were often treated in depth separately but not considered together, food and war. I do hope you enjoy this day as much as I enjoyed putting this program together, and I thank you for your time coming here and your attention. But one last thing, I'd like to thank people who have made today possible. And I want to offer a special thanks to my two research assistants, Caris McGill and Leighton Clark, who have worked tirelessly during finals and Caris preparing to graduate to make today happen. At the School of International Service, Anya Shimon, Dean of Communications, and her team, Amy Gillespie, Cara Langanes, and Ann Deakins, have provided invaluable assistance and advice. Alicia Cummings of the Hub has been the floor manager and all-around advisor, bringing our ideas to reality. And what would we do without Paul Johnson of the AU Communication teams, who has been a friend and supporter over the years? Caterer Carlos Cesario is a chef and visionary, and he's also made it possible for us to eat our conflict cuisine lunches today. You'll hear from him later. And finally, I'm grateful for the generous gift of the Mann Paller Foundation that allowed us to host this day, and for that family who had the confidence in me to believe in the concept of conflict cuisines. So I will let the panel start. I think we're actually at 10:30, which is correct. And you have a great day in store for you. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, here we begin. My name is Gary Weaver, and I'm a professor here in the School of International Service for about 48 years. And I'm also the executive director of the Intercultural Management Institute. And we train diplomats, we train business executives, many different types of people to go overseas, to work overseas, to relocate, to negotiate contracts, to be more effective in public diplomacy and so forth. And we've been around since 1957. So my job is to kind of moderate the panel rather than to give a talk, and I won't give a talk. I will say a few words. Let me first tell you that we're going to be fairly informal. I mean, each of the presenters here will speak for a few minutes, and if we have time toward the end, we will open it up to Q&A, and I suspect there are microphones that will be handed around so that you can ask questions. It's important you use the microphones, and I think the reason is because we're streaming this thing live, and we found that out when we were talking up front here casually. So it's important for people who aren't here to hear you. And I'm sure people will be drifting in and out. My hunch is there'll be many more people here when the food is ready. And if you need to get a cup of coffee or go to the restroom, please feel free to get up and get your coffee. My area is culture, intercultural communications, and so we connect culture with diplomacy, and this gives us a slightly different perspective than just foreign policy. I mean, when we think of culture here in the United States and in many other countries, we often think of art, music, literature, and food. And yes, these are parts of culture, but we would argue in my area that these are the results of culture. Culture is inside your head. It includes your basic values, your beliefs, your worldviews that have been handed down from one generation to another through learning. Now, we can examine the art, the music, the literature, and the food of a group of people and assume they share a certain set of common values and beliefs and worldviews, but the art, the music, and the literature in and of itself is not what most of us in this field refer to as culture. Again, culture is inside your head, and one way to visualize it graphically is think of culture as a gigantic iceberg, and what you see, the tip of the iceberg, is the smallest part, and this is where I would put language, art, music, and so forth. But the largest part of culture is totally underwater, and this includes your basic values, your beliefs, your worldviews. Now, what happens when two icebergs come together, like in public diplomacy or any kind of intercultural relations? What you notice, first of all, is they speak a different language, they eat different food, they have different customs, and we worry about making a mistake at this level, saying the wrong word, and of course, most of us would say, don't worry about it that much. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you say the wrong word. I mean, nobody's going to toss you out of the country. I mean, I hear this all the time from international students. I'm afraid to speak up in a class because my English isn't so good. Well, for the Americans sitting here, do we care if you murder English? I mean, come on, most of our ancestors couldn't speak English. We've had presidents who had problems with English. I mean, this is not the end of the world. The problem is when the icebergs collide, they collide at the base. And when you're dealing with people who are culturally different, you just wake up one morning and it occurs to you that they're not playing cards with the same deck you use back home. They don't think the way you do. They don't share your worldviews, your values. You're disoriented, you're confused, but that's when you're really learning culture because you're asking the question, why? And the only way you can answer the question why is to put yourself in their psychological and cultural shoes. Can you understand the way they look at the world, the way they think? But equally important when cultures come together, either at the dinner table or at an international conference, is you're forced to ask yourself the question, and why am I reacting this way? In other words, the research is very clear that the way we find our culture is to leave it and to interact with those who are culturally different. And that's what most of our panelists are really talking about when we talk about food and public diplomacy. What happens when people come together? For example, I might go to southern Greece, to a small village, and I see a Greek woman down on her hands and knees picking up breadcrumbs with her fingertips. As an average American, what might I assume? She's starving, trying to save each crumb of bread to feed herself and feed her family. So I give her a few dollars to buy a few loaves of bread. Or I might assume she's starving and she's trying to keep her floors clean, unlittered. So I give her money to buy a broom. In both cases, I would offend the woman. Why? Because I don't understand the value she places on bread. Bread in southern Greece in a small village is a sacred food. It's her sacred duty to pick up bread with her fingertips. To do otherwise would be sacrilege. In the Greek Orthodox Mass, when the priest converts the bread into the body of Christ ritualistically, the priest holds an instrument underneath shaped like a plate. Roman Catholics call it a paten, to catch each crumb of bread from dropping to the ground, because at this point the bread is sacred. This same attitude toward bread is extended into her everyday life. And if you don't understand the value she places on bread, you totally misinterpret the behavior and you offend the woman. But now that you realize why she's picking up bread with her fingertips, you also know this woman's very religious. And religion must permeate every aspect of her everyday life, and everyone else in the village is Greek Orthodox, so religion must have some impact on their public policy, the way in which they negotiate. You see, by understanding the value or motive behind one behavior, you've now opened the door to explaining many behaviors. And that's why this conference is so important, because it really allows you to understand the base of the iceberg, not just the tip of the iceberg. In France, if you get invited to dinner, believe me, it's a big deal. Very often, you don't invite riffraff into your house for dinner to be in the intimacy of your family with your wife and your children and your husband and so forth. You very carefully select the guests. And sometimes you do your homework. You find out if they're going to be out of town because you know they're going to feel so bad if they can't say yes. And of course, when you come into their home, everything is prepared. Why? Because you want to honor your guests. In the Middle East, every single inch on the table is covered with food. If I've got a bowl of potatoes here, I'll put another bowl here to cover. Now, you can never eat that much food, but the idea is you honor your guests by having all the food. And we Americans come off as a little chintzy. I mean, we have one potato, one steak, one salad. Now, you couldn't eat more than that. But it isn't the food that's important. It's the gesture and the values behind the food. Why do they do this? I mean, that's the point. We invite people to dinner. We can't remember their name the next day. I mean, believe me, in France, that doesn't happen. And of course, it's not just an invitation to dinner. As Joanna was saying, it's an invitation to a relationship. It's the hand of friendship. And I don't invite you to dinner if I don't want to be your friend. So again, these are the kinds of things I think we're going to be talking about today. And we have a wonderful panel up here. And I've asked each of them to talk as much as they want, but no longer than 8 minutes. And we have to end at 11:45 rather. And I know at least one of us, maybe two of us, will have to leave a little bit earlier because we have to teach and students pay our salaries. So we may be skipping out. And we have another panel coming right behind us. What I'd like to do is introduce each panel member just before they speak. And I'll begin with Tara Sonnenschein, who's a professor at George Washington University. And Tara and I just met briefly, and you've got her bio here. She is the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and certainly one of the experts on our panel in the whole area of public diplomacy. So with that, let me introduce Tara.
Use the...
Sure.
You know what, we needed the Barbara Mikulski box, though.
That's right. You look like the Queen of England. That's
Okay. Well, let me thank Johanna and Anita and AU and all of you, especially all of you, because without dinner guests or lunch guests or breakfast guests, without you, we don't have the table. And someone once said, we need the consumers so that we can enjoy the meal. So a round of applause for each of you and all of you for being here. Since food is a form of engagement, I want this to be very much an interactive day, so I'm going to do what you do with a good pie. I'm going to slice my remarks in half, and I'm going to toss them away and just give you some overview about public diplomacy and what happened under Secretary Clinton to form and give a real formal place at the table for food and for culinary or culinary, and I love the fact you can say it either way because that's very foodish. So we'll use it interchangeably today. But I begin with a question. How many of you like to eat? Now see, we could wrap up the conference right now because we found a point of agreement. How many of you like different kinds of foods? Again, we could end right here. And the reason I stress that is that diplomacy is about finding common ground. It really is about figuring out where people intersect in the most human of ways so that they might be able to put their differences aside and find some way to get along. And in fact, the Greeks and the Romans found that one way they could deal with their enemies was to put food out on the table for the enemies and then break the ice think of these expressions. Break the ice, break bread, sit at the table. Our vocabulary is really one of diplomacy. So in 2012, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came really before even 2012 with an idea that we should use what she called smart power. Now, how many of you have heard of hard power? Hard power, traditionally, we think of use of military and force as a way of pressuring people to get to a certain place. How many of you have heard of soft power? So traditionally, we thought of soft power as things like ballet and film and music. And frankly, I never really liked the notion of soft versus hard, because the reality is that we use a mix of soft power and hard power. But what the secretary coined, although others will now, when something is successful, everybody claims credit for having coined it. We all have learned that. But smart power was meant to include information technology, for one, but also the notion of being smart about how you use power. And that meant opening the minds of ambassadors and embassies and people around the world. What else could we have in our arsenal, to use a military term, but what could we have in our toolbox of diplomacy that might help particularly our overseas audiences connect with America? And of course, food is such an obvious point of connection that we began to think about how could you include it in a formal way in our public diplomacy. So the notion of deploying chefs around the world, bringing chefs to the United States, drawing on the power of the people who prepare food as a way of reaching out across the table. And so these partnerships, these culinary partnerships emerged, and a program was put in place initially in the Office of Protocol. Why? And Anita referenced this: state dinners, banquets, all of the surrounding diplomacy that happens when you have foreign dignitaries. It seemed a logical place to put this program. But then as we looked across the State Department, we realized that we also have other programs, namely exchange programs, that would be ideally suited for that kind of educational and cultural relationship building. So we began to integrate food diplomacy into this. Now, something you will hear again and again today. Food is both a fun subject and a very serious subject. Food comes down to those who can eat, those who don't have enough to eat. Food is about war and about peace. Food is about too much in the way of obesity and too little in the way of hunger. We have food security issues, we have food assistance issues. So we have to be a little careful if we come too jovially to the subject of food, to be cognizant that it is at times a weapon, it is at times a war mechanism, but it is also a bridge builder. Why? Food is emotional. It smells. It triggers memory. It references history. It probes your culture. It is partly definitional about who you are. So I close my opening remarks, and we'll get into this with the Q&A, with, of course, a story. We all have stories. And mine, similar to Johanna's and similar to Anita's, I was born into a family with immigrant grandparents who spoke only Yiddish. Not a word of English. Well, a couple of words. And the memory very quickly I have is of my grandmother, Pauline, who lived in Brooklyn, arriving at the train station in Long Island to visit us. And she did know a couple of sentences. She would put a coin in the phone box, whatever we used to call those things, that you would put money in, and people are smiling because it's, again, memory. And she would put the money in, and she would dial our phone number, and she would say the following: "I'm at the station. I have the blintzes." And with that, I'll turn to our next panelist.
Well, thank you, Tara. Very good. Our next speaker is Paul Rockauer, and Paul is a graduate of the USC Master of Public Diplomacy program. He's also currently the executive director of Levantine Public Diplomacy, an independent public and cultural diplomacy organization. Paul?
Thank you. I'm actually going to give my remarks from the table if you guys don't mind. Keep it a little more informal. I'd like to thank Joanna Mendelsohn-Forman, Dr. Joanna Mendelsohn-Forman, for putting on this tremendous conference, for really helping expand the boundaries of gastrodiplomacy and looking at new ways in which food relates to foreign policy, to conflict. Tremendous thank you to the panelists on this. Tara, those were fantastic remarks. Thank you. And for all the work you've done as Undersecretary, the most successful, I would say, person to hold the position of Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. So thank you. Thank you to AU for hosting this. This would be the second Gastrodiplomacy Summit that AU has had. So when my colleague Mary Jo Pham, who had been at AU, said that AU was the capital of gastrodiplomacy, I kind of took umbrage at this since I come from USC, which helped invent gastrodiplomacy, but I think she might have actually been correct at this point. Thank you to all of you for coming today. It's really an honor. So. I was actually at AU last week doing a hip-hop diplomacy symposium. I work on the Next Level program, which is a hip-hop diplomacy program through the U.S. State Department and the University of North Carolina. And we just had hip-hop artists from India, Bangladesh, Serbia, Bosnia, Senegal, and Zimbabwe. And then our last night in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill, we finished all of our big program, and we dined together at Waffle House. And they loved Waffle House. And one of them remarked to me something I will never forget. They said, "Why don't you put these Waffle Houses in your embassies?" So, smothered, covered, scattered, diced diplomacy, what you will. So I plan to begin my remarks by quoting the great gastrodiplomat Gandhi. But I first had to wonder if I could actually call Gandhi a great gastrodiplomat, because if any of you have read Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth, you read a lot about his decisions on diet, and Gandhi abstained from many foods. He didn't eat spices or pulses because he thought that it affected his emotions. So I wasn't sure if I could call Gandhi a great gastrodiplomat, but when I thought about it, it was Gandhi's work fighting the British tax on salt, his march to the sea to fight against the British campaign of salt taxes that helped begin the downfall of the British Raj. It was his use of fasting to help stop the communal violence that was taking place during partition in India. So of course Gandhi, I think, does get the title of a great gastrodiplomat. And it was Gandhi who said, "I have nothing new to offer. Truth and nonviolence are as old as the hills." By the same token, I don't think any of us have anything new to offer, because connecting people through food, through music, through culture, through dance, through the arts is as old as the hills. But the question then becomes, what does gastrodiplomacy have to offer? What does culinary diplomacy have to offer? What does conflict cuisine have to offer? And that's where I think we have an interesting discussion today. In defining the field of gastrodiplomacy, we have to ask, what is gastrodiplomacy? How does it relate to its cousin of culinary diplomacy? And where does this all fit together? And I would say that all of these things that I mentioned, in music, in food, in culture, these emotional transrational connections that are something that connect to us on a real visceral level. Hearing Tara talk about her grandmother and the blintzes, this fact that the sense of smell, the sense of taste are so deeply tied to our nostalgia. They're so hardwired to who we are and carry such an emotional legacy. The question of where does gastrodiplomacy fit in all of this in the canon of public diplomacy, where does culinary diplomacy fit is this. Really gastrodiplomacy is the nexus of food and foreign policy. And what I would say is how countries communicate their culture through their food. It's the use of restaurants as forward cultural outposts. It's an idea that flag can follow fork, or chopsticks, or any other number of ways of eating. Fingers. I spend most of my days eating with my hands. And I think it's important to understand the relationship between gastrodiplomacy and culinary diplomacy. And to understand that, you have to understand the relationship between diplomacy and public diplomacy. So diplomacy is high-level communications between governments. It can be very secretive. It's very direct between governments. There's not a lot of room for outside actors. It is official. Public diplomacy is very much the antithesis of diplomacy. It is how governments or non-state actors communicate with people. It's the communication of ideas to foreign publics, and it involves a lot more than just governments. It involves people-to-people diplomacy. It involves a whole wide variety and a very different audience than diplomacy. And so by that token, I would argue that diplomacy is to public diplomacy what culinary diplomacy is to gastrodiplomacy. Culinary diplomacy, at least as a number of us have defined the field, is the use of food in the diplomatic connections. So what you serve at state dinners, what would you serve to the King of Morocco? What would you serve involving, heads of state? And there are, things like Club de Chef, which my colleague Sam Chappell-Sokol works on, which is very much connected to the culinary diplomacy side of things. But that doesn't always connect to what I would say is gastrodiplomacy, which is the public diplomacy of food. It's how you communicate your culture through your food, how you reach out to foreign audiences and share your culture and share your history and your heritage through your food. And that's a very different understanding. It's a way of doing edible nation branding to foreign publics. And really what we've talked about in gastrodiplomacy, for many years it was middle powers, countries that are not great states and are not small powers who were conducting gastrodiplomacy. So it was countries like Taiwan, like Peru, like South Korea, who were trying to create some understanding of their nation brand and their edible nation brand through gastrodiplomacy so that their understanding in the broad context of the international landscape was stronger. In the more recent past, we've seen countries like the U.S. in the Culinary Diplomatic Partnership, or France, who, as Joanna mentioned, has claimed to have invented gastrodiplomacy. And if they invented gastrodiplomacy, then I invented the croissant, but that's a different story. So you see other countries who already have strong culinary brands, culinary nation brands, begin to engage in gastrodiplomacy, but in a very different fashion than a country like Peru or Taiwan would do so. And with the U.S. or with China or with France, who already has a strong gastrodiplomacy brand, you see nuance. You see a focus on regional cuisines. You see the people-to-people connection that Tara mentioned. And so you see a greater understanding of the regional varieties. It's not just sharing, Peru's cuisine writ large, it's sharing the nuances in the American brand and being able to create greater understanding that the food in the Pacific Northwest is not the same as the food in Texas. And France is beginning to do this as well, trying to show the different flavors, the different variations. China, I believe, is also starting to do this, trying to show the different regional cuisines. So there is part of the question of what gastrodiplomacy entails is understanding the best practices of the field and defining the field. Because this is a field of practice, it's a field of study. It's, as I mentioned, this is the second gastrodiplomacy assignment. There are articles coming out in journals, in magazines, there was even a gastrodiplomacy edition in the Public Diplomacy magazine. So it's helpful for the field itself to understand the framework, to understand how it all connects together. And the biggest difference between culinary diplomacy and gastrodiplomacy is the people-to-people connection, something that Joanna has very much looked into with conflict cuisine. And I think that is really the part that I would like to end with is the people-to-people connection, and the role that she's looked at and this conference is looking at and the class is looking at is the empowerment of diasporic chefs to share their cuisines in the new countries, to take pride in the culinary culture that they've left behind, but still carry with them and share as their cultural heritage in the new lands that they reside. And the beauty, I think, of gastrodiplomacy is it becomes a medium to empower so many people, but most importantly, diasporic chefs as they convey these cultural traditions. And so we'll continue this discussion, but I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thank you to the rest of the panel, and thank you to Joanna.
Thank you, Paul. Now we're going to we're going to try something a little bit different. We have a video that we're going to be showing of our next speaker who couldn't be here today, but Sam Chappell-Sokol, I hope I haven't destroyed his name, did allow us to use this video. He's a research consultant and culinary diplomat who's worked on academic courses at American University and George Washington, as well as various other organizations. Sam has a master's degree in conflict resolution and international development from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a bachelor's from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. So we're going to show this short video with Sam, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. And we will have time at the end for Q&A from all of you. So, and I'll ask you to address anybody on the panel during that period. So are we ready?
Good morning from San Francisco. I'm sorry I'm not able to attend this innovative and interdisciplinary conference, but I appreciate that you're all patient enough to watch me ramble into the camera for a few minutes. Johanna, thank you for inviting me to participate, and to my fellow panelists, I wish I could be there to speak with you about this exciting new field of research. By way of background, I've been involved in the field of culinary diplomacy in one way or another for a few years, since conducting some early research on the topic while a master's student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. In that original paper, which was published in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, I attempted to build on top of the work that my colleague in the field, my virtual co-panelist Paul Rockauer, had done during and after his own master's research at USC. Based on that original research and the people I met, I was able to take on a series of projects both studying and conducting culinary diplomacy, from working on university courses with Jose Andres and Dr. Mendelsohn Forman, to leading a culinary tour for a group of chefs, heads of state, to moonlighting as White House pastry chef. So now to the substance. I keep mentioning this term, so now I should define it. What is culinary diplomacy? To me, culinary diplomacy is the use of food or of a cuisine as a tool to create cross-cultural understanding in the hopes of improving interactions and cooperation. It's no more, no less than that. Senator Clinton, as Secretary of State, called this the oldest form of diplomacy when announcing the U.S. State Department's diplomatic culinary partnership in 2012. You may have heard the concept termed as gastrodiplomacy, a term I use pretty much interchangeably with culinary diplomacy. Paul may tell you that culinary diplomacy occurs at the official level between government officials. I will quote him directly to say that culinary diplomacy is a means to further diplomatic protocol through cuisine. He'll say that gastrodiplomacy is more of a public diplomacy tool, or to other writers, only done at the citizen-to-citizen level. I think that at base we're discussing the same thing, which is manifested at different levels by different actors. Commensality, which comes from the Latin com meaning with, and mensa meaning table, is as powerful for heads of state as it is for families, for new friends and old enemies. When Paul and I sit at the table together, we forget our semantic differences and embrace the cooperation and communion that occurs through breaking bread. Now that I've discussed the terminology a bit, I'll get into a few manifestations of culinary diplomacy / gastrodiplomacy. At the state level, we have, of course, state dinners. Meals between heads of state in which the host tries to impress the guest with a combination of national cuisine and perhaps a nod to the guest's culinary tradition. For example, at last year's France State Dinner, the White House served caviar from Illinois and Vermont blue cheese, two American takes on foods dear to the French. The dessert was a French-American mashup, a hostess yodel-like chocolate cake rich with silky French-style ganache, made with Hawaiian chocolate, a clear reference to the American president's birthplace. At the summit of this state-level diplomacy is Le Club des Chefs, or Club of Chefs of Heads of State. This group, which has convened for an annual visit since 1977, is a private forum for these talk, to compare notes on their bosses' predilections and allergies, and perhaps share a recipe or two. I was lucky enough to bring this group to Amish country, where we joined a farming community for lunch, the first time this group of Amish had created a coursed meal and a cheese plate, and the first time the chefs had met such a cloistered and storied group of farmers. At the next level is public diplomacy, that is, government to citizen. We've seen a huge rise in this type of diplomacy in the last 15 years. I'll let Paul and Professor Sonnenschein tell you a bit more about these initiatives, but the big picture takes us from Southeast Asia, where Thailand pioneered the spread of its cuisine through government-funded initiatives Global Thai and Thailand Kitchen of the World, to South Korea, which followed suit and launched a Korean Cuisine to the World campaign, replete with the Kimchi Research Institute and the so-called bibimbap backpackers. Peru, Mexico, Malaysia, and the US are pursuing similar public diplomacy campaigns. The American campaign, which I mentioned briefly earlier, was launched while Professor Sonnenschein was Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs at State. 100 or so American chefs were named culinary ambassadors and tasked to cook worldwide and represent their country. Our chefs have led pastry competitions in Algeria, slung Texas barbecue in Kyrgyzstan, and presented on nutrition to Palestinian culinary students in Bethlehem. Beyond each individual country's initiative, culinary diplomacy is now on the international stage. This year's World's Fair, the Milan Expo, is a 6-month-long public culinary diplomacy festival, with each nation building a pavilion to represent the best of its cuisine. If you get a chance to make it to Milan, observe how countries choose to brand themselves with food, and ask yourself if the American pavilion has done the country justice. Finally, culinary diplomacy can take place at the citizen level. Eating dinner at your local Thai restaurant or stumbling on a neighborhood Eritrean place allows you to meet people from a different background that you otherwise may not encounter. The simple act of eating food from a different country and meeting a few folks from elsewhere allows each of us to connect in a visceral, deeply personal way to the history and culture of that country, even if we don't realize it. I think most of us know more about Thailand than we do about Laos, and more about Ethiopia than Eritrea, and it's because we have access to their food spread through the diaspora. It is from this citizen level of culinary diplomacy, spread through diaspora populations, that our discussion of conflict cuisines can take root. Sure, Obama and Rouhani can share a kebab and a Coke, or perhaps more likely Obama and Castro sharing a Cubano sandwich, but that doesn't engender deep peace. It needs to be at the citizen level, through personal encounters over a meal, for deep shifts to take place. There are many more qualified people than myself at this conference to speak at length on this topic, so I'll wrap it up, but I hope you've learned a little from this whirlwind overview of culinary diplomacy. Again, I'm sorry I couldn't join you today, but if you have any follow-up questions for me or anything you'd like me to clarify, don't hesitate to reach out at culinarydiplomacy@gmail.com or over Twitter. I'm at culinarydiplo. I'll be checking the hashtag conflict cuisine all day, as much as I can at work, in order to get some real-time responses in. Thank you all again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you to Johanna for inviting me to do this. Good morning from San Francisco. I'm sorry I'm not able to attend this innovative and interdisciplinary conference, but I
Okay. That's right, that's right. That's why I wanted this to,
minor differences.
Combat.
that's why I wanted this to follow Paul, so that rather than putting it off later.
Yeah, he's here to defend himself.
That's right. Paul, do you have any comments?
Freud spoke of the narcissism of minor differences. We'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, let's move on. Our next presenter, Kimberly Reed, is the Executive Director of International Food Information Council. She has served as Senior Vice President for Membership, Communications, and Strategic Initiatives at IFIC. And she's had a long career in this whole area of handling food and its relationship to public diplomacy. I won't say any more because her bio is in your materials. So without any further comments, Kimberly Reed.
Do we have a clicker here? I'm just curious. Okay, so I'm going to try to pull it over here. Well, thank you so much. And it's exciting to be back. When I was a law student, I grew up in West Virginia, but I was a law student interning in Washington. And in the summer of 1995, I also attended American University Law School at night. And so this is the first time I've been back. And thank you so much, Dr. Johanna Mendelsohn Foreman, for inviting me today. I work for an organization called the International Food Information Council here in Washington, D.C., and our job is to help communicate that science about food safety, nutrition, and health. And I want to talk to you today about the theme of today, but I also want to share some insights into Expo Milano because, as our previous speaker mentioned, this is going to be the world's largest, most historical gathering on food for 6 months. As I mentioned, I'm originally from West Virginia. Does anyone know the state food of West Virginia? The pepperoni roll. And if you go to a gas station in West Virginia, you will see right by the checkout counter a pepperoni roll. What is a pepperoni roll? It is a hot roll filled with pepperoni and cheese. And you can get it in normal cheese without a lot of taste, provolone, something like that, or a hot pepper cheese. And you eat it hot. Why do we have this? This is a historical thing in my state. The Greeks and the Italians came to West Virginia in the early 1900s to work in the mines. And the wives would bake this pepperoni roll for them to take down in the mines. So it was a self-containing lunch for them. And so that is our state food from today. But food has been such an important part of my life growing up in a rural town and being involved in something called 4-H, where I learned to speak about and do public presentations on food and agriculture. And that has led me here to you today. Previously, I worked in the government, both in the legislative and executive branches, and I can't tell you, in a lot of negotiations with foreign countries, how important deals got made, or conversations were formed, or relationships were built, not in that meeting space, but afterwards at that meal in China or Sudan or in Jordan. That bond of food and sharing that special moment together helps forge so much that happens, not only in our country, but around the world. One thing that we focus on at the International Food Information Council is communicating the science about biotechnology. And I don't want to talk to you a lot about that today, but at the end you'll see how we're going to be talking about this as part of Expo Milano. And I've left for you at the table this Biotechnology Communicator's Guide. Biotechnology, also known as GMOs, is a very sensitive topic, a very emotional topic. And I just want to share with you that it is so important to understand the facts and science about this as you go and have conversations around the world. I don't know if you know who this gentleman is, Norman Borlaug. He's the father of the Green Revolution, and he was so essential for ensuring that millions of people were able to eat. And we continue that legacy on with him today through something called the World Food Prize, which is an annual prize given out like a Nobel Peace Prize to those people who make a difference in feeding our planet. So I'm going to not go through these slides with you, but just keep in mind with biotechnology that there are a lot of benefits. And as we focus on feeding a hungry world, I want to be focused on that for you. And I'm going to go through these slides like this, but you can go back because I know that these slides will be made available to you. But as we talk about topics such as sustainability and reducing our carbon footprint, and how we improve the economic situation of families worldwide. And here's a quote from Bill Gates about the importance of biotechnology and food security. Just know that this is at the forefront of our country's negotiations and discussions all around the world with key emerging markets. And this is how Joanna and I first met. We met at the Council on Foreign Relations talking about an important topic related to food security, and that is the value that food can bring to your body through not only being concerned about things like non-communicable disease, obesity, heart disease, and others, but fortification of food and the value that biotechnology can put into foods to help us feed our planet. And why are we so focused on this? Today we have 7 million people on this planet. By 2050, we're going to have 9.6 billion people. We've got to feed all of those people. And it's going to require 70% more food that is produced than today. And so if you are even considering a career in food, and that's why I'm so happy to see all of you here, whether it be on the science and STEM side, the chef side, whatever you choose, 2 billion people are going to be looking at this generation to help them have a nice life. And so I hope that you will be part of that. So I also want to mention here Expo Milano. So if you are available from May through October, I hope you buy a plane ticket to Milan. The theme of this year's World's Fair happens every 5 years, is Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. As I mentioned, it's going to be the world's largest, most historical gathering on food. You can see some of the thematic routes, and I'm sure in your coursework here that you discuss so many of these. I can't think of a better way to see public diplomacy on food happen than in Milan. We're going to have 144 countries participating. They're building and will soon be opening their pavilions at the fairgrounds. And those countries represent 94% of the world's population. We also have international organizations such as the UN, NGOs, and we will be one of those engaging corporate pavilions. But there are going to be a lot of people having those discussions. And this is also going to be exciting for you to take your coursework and share that online. You just take that social media effort that you know so well and use that hashtag and plug in Expo Milano's hashtag in your discussions. And you will be surprised that you're going to be able to engage with millions and millions of people online on so many interesting issues. Every country will have a pavilion, and you can go online and see what their themes are. Here are just a few. But they're going to be talking about everything from sustainability to cocoa to rice, to just the fabulous cuisine that is valued in each country. And I agree, it'll be interesting to see each country's take on each of these issues. Here's what our USA Pavilion is entitled, American Food 2.0, United to Feed the Planet. And what you see here is what we would call a mock-up of a grain elevator. And on the outside of it are going to be live gardens, vertical gardens. And they're going to have acrobats on the outside of that pavilion harvesting those greens and serving them as part of the meals that you can have inside. Why is it called American Food 2.0? Because the United States is intelligently and thoughtfully engaged in food and global food security. And we want to be focusing on responsibility, the importance of international relationship, science and technology, nutrition and health, and culinary culture. All of these things will be discussed within our pavilion. I'm going to just show you here, these are message boards of some of those themes as you're walking through our USA Pavilion, what you're going to be seeing. 1 in 9 billion, as we talked about that, going from 7 to 9 billion people over the next few years. American Policy 2.0. We know with the First Lady's Let's Move initiative and so much on what we're doing here in this country, we're going to be sharing those messages with the world. Farming. What does it take to do what we do? The American story of farming and agriculture. The cooking aspect, which I'm really looking forward to. So the fabulous chefs and how they're being thought leaders on so much of what we're doing here. And I know that there are going to be food trucks outside of our USA Pavilion, so you can go and purchase a meal there. And also those American food trucks are going to be driving around the streets of Milan as well. Advertising expo, so that'll be really interesting. Nutrition. So much we care about as we go into something called the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. I don't know if you know this, but every 5 years, our country and our government looks at the latest science on nutrition and health, and they go through a very thoughtful, deliberative process to decide what our latest policies should be. And so we have our American guidelines coming out this year, and so you will be able to learn a little bit more about that. Also the role of industry, which is so important in feeding all of these millions and millions of people, and what it is doing. Our economy and how it is related to feeding our planet and the role of it. Research and food security. And food security has a lot of different definitions, and so you'll see some of those being explored. I must say a few years ago, right when I joined the International Food Information Council, a friend of mine invited me as his date to a very small dinner party. And it was filled with the former CIA head as well as other national security officials in our country. And I'm here just as a date. And there are maybe 15 of us. And all of a sudden the former CIA director asked us to go around the table and say what's top of mind and most concerned to us as an individual on the topic of world security. And I'm like, this is not really my field. What am I going to say to this very esteemed group? And when it came to my turn, you know what I said? Mr. Director, my concern is that our planet's going to go from 7 to 9 billion people. And we need to be worried about feeding these people, because if you're thirsty and you're hungry, a lot of other things stem from that. And he then looked at me and everyone in the room and he said, you know, that is the white elephant in the room. And so it means a lot to a lot of different people, this theme of food security. So as part of that, we're going to be, the International Food Information Council, we're going to be doing a communication summit as part of Expo. But our communication summit is going to be taking place on May 20th, not in Milan, but in Rome, because our target audience is something called the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So those leading people having voice from all around the world to FAO. And so we're going to be having a thoughtful day-long discussion, and we're going to have speakers from all over the world, journalists and scientists and those who are good risk communicators, and also some farmers. So I'm really excited to be there for that. Our keynote speakers, the gentleman in the center their ambassador, Kenneth Quinn, who is the president of the World Food Prize Foundation. And that's another thing I want to put on your radar that takes place every fall in Des Moines, Iowa. And that is the honoring of the World Food Prize Award each year. And that's something that any of you can attend. And it's such a thoughtful discussion with many different panels and world leaders attend every year. So just to let you know about that. And I thank you so much for having me here today. And as you go to Expo Milano, guess what? Our big food that we'll be serving in the USA Pavilion to show our history is going to be in our culture and tradition. Thanksgiving dinner. So I hope that you get to partake of that, and I look forward to seeing what other people around the world have to say about our Thanksgiving dinner. Thank you.
Well, let me thank our panelists. I think they did a great job, Tara, Kimberly, and Paul, and of course, Sam. At this point, we're open to questions or comments, anything you might have to ask the panel or something you might like to say. Do we have microphones available for people to ask questions? Yes, we do. So if you just raise your hand, somebody will bring you a microphone, and that way the people who are following us on stream, here's a question or a comment over here.
Hello, my name is Asia. Thank you for all coming. I'm really excited to meet you or see you, Mr. Rockwell, because I just wrote a paper and I cited you a lot. But my question is, so I've been reading about gastrodiplomacy, more so than culinary diplomacy, but gastrodiplomacy, and I read an article about indigenization of food, and I was wondering what you thought about how important is it, I guess, that the food that is being used as these national brands is served in its authentic form? For example, I know a lot of, for example, Ethiopian food I've had, I'm sure is not necessarily exactly the same as it would be in Ethiopia. How important is that to that nation's brand? How important is that to my understanding of their culture?
Well, that's an excellent question, Asia. Thank you. So I think you raise a very good point of the authenticity of what you're trying to share. And I think that on many levels, there needs to be that authenticity of showing what it is that you're trying to promote. On some levels, you need to have some accessibility. So I couldn't serve the spiciest Indian food to American audiences which love mild salsa. You need to have a delicate balance between having something that is both authentic but also accessible. In terms of indigenization of food, I think that's a wonderful, concept, and I think that there's a lot of room for really looking at the indigenization of food. For one thing, here in Washington, one of the most popular restaurants is the restaurant at the Native American Museum, and so the idea of Native American cuisine as something that could be a form of American gastrodiplomacy. I'm familiar with an organization, Brunitsky and Company or Corporation, who does a lot of work with cultural diplomacy with Native American artists and does a lot of work promoting indigenous foods, Native American foods, abroad in food fairs and otherwise. And my understanding is it's quite a powerful form of gastrodiplomacy. I would say simply that you have to strike a balance of both, because good public diplomacy, good cultural diplomacy is always listening and understanding your audiences. So you have to, strike that balance between what is authentic and what is accessible, what is palatable to the audiences, and you can, you can play with this. You can have the fusion foods that have become so popular, such as Korean tacos. That's not something that's authentically, South Korean, and yet there's now a Korean taco place that's opened up in Seoul. So there's room for boomerangs within gastrodiplomacy of the innovations, the things that aren't authentic, but yet, create an interesting discussion for culture through those fusions.
Tara?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would only add, I think the balance is right. And the balance that you have to strike actually is between credibility, which is the cornerstone of public diplomacy, is this credible? And the other side of the coin, which is that imitation is the highest form of flattery. So you can imitate a cuisine and risk somebody saying that's really not Northern Italian cuisine. The only last thing I would put out there for us to think about is drink. Now, we've talked a lot about food, but think about wine and the branding that nations go through, French, Italian, and others around their wine. And think about what it is you do when you toast. You, in a sense, are toasting often to peaceful relations. And I'm always struck by how arguing parties can argue and then toast. And the last thing I would tell you to think about in terms of credibility and authenticity is a single word: hummus. You can get fights between Israelis, Arabs, Palestinians, who has the most authentic hummus in the region. And that's what I call healthy debate.
Kimberly?
Yes. I just have a extra comment on your toast comment. Will you do cheers with me, please? Cheers.
I was going to give the
Cheers.
exact same
Cheers.
anecdote. I know
Cheers.
exactly
Okay.
where this is
So
going.
I know where you're going to.
what just happened? We did something very common here in our country. We toasted each other and did cheers. But what we just did probably was offensive to people in another country. And why is that? Because we looked at the glasses to make sure that we hit that glass, that we touched that glass. In several countries, if you don't look the person in the eyes when you do that, it is rude and an insult. And think about you going over and doing some diplomatic effort and not knowing that little important background, not doing your research, and what message you might say after a long negotiation on something really important. So that's just a reminder to all of us to do your homework, because what's normal for us might be highly insulting to someone else. But cheers.
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 And I have one more anecdote on the cheers side of things, and this is something I heard recently. It's veracity I can't claim to credit, but at least it's an interesting story, and it sounds true enough. So my understanding is that cheers, very clinking glasses, came from the Vikings, and one of the reasons they would do that was to try and mix all of the drinks together in case that somebody had tried to poison your drink, that you would get them all in the same thing, and so it was a way of mutually assured destruction.
And I've heard that you should leave a space and not actually touch.
Huh.
And I cannot tell you why you leave a space. But remember also something about women and drink. And in certain parts of the country, the world, what is in your drink? Is it chai? Is it tea? Is it liquor? So this cultural sensitivity around what we eat and drink is, again, the positive and negative side of respecting people's strongly held views about food and drink.
If I can just add a quick point, because I didn't get to toast everybody here, but in some cultures, you actually touch the glass beneath the glass to show the superiority or the respect for the higher ranking person. And it's kind of funny when you're not sure who's the highest rank, and you keep going lower and lower until you're lower than the person you're toasting. So the customs vary enormously, and I guess the point I would make is what I started out with. It's not so much the beverage as it is the custom that surrounds the beverage. That's the real key, and that's culturally based to a large extent. Other questions or comments from anybody? Way over the gentleman who looks like a chef. Who is a chef? Definitely.
The flavor of the food is also really important when you're engaging in this gastro diplomacy. And from a chef's perspective, we go a really far distance to ensure that
Could you hold the mic a little bit closer?
that the flavor is well seasoned, and that everybody can appreciate a certain amount of taste in the food without necessarily being overwhelmed by a spice that they're not familiar with or an ingredient that they're not familiar with. And to have the successful flavor in the table is to have the success of the meeting, because if the food is not good, then the aura of the situation changes completely, and you may not be able to engage in the diplomacy that you're looking for. So food is at the center of this discussion for a reason, and the chefs that are cooking the food have a lot of input into how the meal is going to go out, hopefully in a positive way.
Thank you, Chef. That's a really important point. Shelley, you had a question or a comment, and then there's a lady here as well.
Very much. In a way, building a little bit on what was just asked, I just returned from Bali, which is, of course, a beautiful culture, beautiful people, beautiful food. And but one of the notable things in Ubud, which is considered to be one of the parts of Bali that best reflects the Balinese culture in so many different ways, both in the arts and the crafts and so forth, is that the top-rated restaurants are actually generally European chefs who've come over. They are using local ingredients, which is wonderful. In fact, one restaurant, Mosaic, serves up, before they serve you, they bring to your table a big wooden bowl filled with local fruits, vegetables, spices, and herbs that are used in their tasting menu. And with each dish that they bring you, they then point out, here's the turmeric, here's the white mango, here's whatever, and you can pick it up and smell it and look at it and just see it in its native form. So it's a wonderful experience. But having said that, to what degree is this a sort of a form of colonialization of these cultures? Because though we thoroughly enjoyed all these meals, in the context of this conversation, suddenly it makes me realize, how authentic is this? And this is in the country. This isn't even us, copying, Northern Italian cuisine or downspicing the Indian food. This is in the country itself. So just thought, I was eager to hear your reaction to that.
Great. Before I invite the panel to react, in my field, this is called cultural hybridity, hybrid. And you combine the two foods to get something different or new. It's like McDonald's not selling a hamburger in India, but something made out of chicken or something like that. You've modified the food. And this is increasing in many, many countries. But let me ask the panel to respond to this.
Sure. Well, to tie together what our chef and what Shelley asked, it's again the flip sides of two coins here, because familiarity breeds contentment. We all feel comfortable when the food tastes the way we're familiar. On the other side, the Europeans coming in and using local ingredients, there is also a field of food experimentation, innovation, and entrepreneurship, which is the ability to take the locally grown produce and do something different or creative. So food is an open-minded field that is willing to dare to not always be exactly what you were looking for.
Mm-hmm. Paul or Kimberly?
I think it's wonderful to have both, and I would say it's important to remind people of the beauty of the most traditional foods from a location, but I think it's great in this global world to explore and experiment, and I think there's room for everything.
Well, I agree with both panelists, and I would actually have a question back to you, did you have the Café Luwak? Yes, this is, if any of you haven't tried this is the coffee that's eaten by the civet and then digested, and all the stomach acids go into the bean, and then the civet cat lets it fly, and they come back and they scoop up the coffee beans and they clean them off and brew the coffee, and it's one of the most expensive cups of coffee in the world.
I also can't not pick up on a word that I heard. I thought I heard the word McDonald's. Now, let me, at the risk of injecting a bit of controversy into this discussion, Tom Friedman had a theory about McDonald's, that if a country opened a McDonald's, it meant that the country was on its way to growth and a sort of free market economy. And I've challenged him on this because I happen to have been covering the former Soviet Union, then Russia, at the time McDonald's opened there. And I will tell you two very quick things. First of all, I went out with my camera crew. It was a big day. McDonald's in Moscow was opening, and they had 5 counters. And the first thing I noticed is everybody was lined up behind one cash register. And I wonder what was wrong with the other 4. It was explained to me that in Russia, you see a line, you get on it. Okay. But I now question in retrospect where we are in foreign policy with Russia, and some news I have heard about potentially closing McDonald's, which now makes me want to go back to Tom Friedman and say, maybe you were right. The opening of them signals something, the closing. So food becomes, again, a wedge issue in relationships. And I heard that word and thought, couldn't miss the opportunity.
I promise I'll not use another dirty word for this whole presentation. This lady here, please.
I'm Gail. I'm from Vermont, and we are the only state our capital does not have a McDonald's, but it is farm to table steak. I have a comment because a friend and I recently started an edible history tour in Burlington. And we look at the ethnic groups that settled Vermont before the 1920s and what their food traditions were. And what struck me and about this whole conference and all of the efforts today about new restaurants opening, the immigrants who settled in Burlington did not open up the restaurants from their countries. So by the 1940s, the Greeks owned every restaurant in Burlington except for 2, and not one of them served Greek food. They thought it was peasant food, and who would want it? And they also wanted to be totally Americanized. And that was true of the Syrians and all the ethnic groups that came in except a Chinese restaurant, an Asian restaurant that opened up. So there's a huge difference in these years, and I think a really good one. The people saved their traditions in their family celebrations and in their homes, and they shared it with neighbors, but they didn't share it with the general public.
I'd love to know more, since I do some work in Brattleboro for World Learning, and would love to know more about Vermont and edibles. I unfortunately have to go to a competing institution, GW, which is hosting a Feed the Planet Summit this week for 2 days with students from around the country. And so in every corner of the city, I think conversations are going on. And again, I thank Johanna Mendelsohn-Foreman and Anita and AU and all of you, and I will go educate people about food.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. All right, are there one or two, this lady here.
Hi, I'm Michelle Manat with Meridian International Center. I have a question for Kimberly. So you gave us a very quick but a very tempting overview of what's going to happen in Milano very soon for the 6 months. What, from your organization's perspective, will be a success at the end of the World's Fair in Milano? And how is the broader global public able to be part of it? Because most people probably are not going to be able to travel there this summer and fall. Thank you.
So I'll take the second part of your question first. Go to the Expo Milano website, just put Expo Milano into Google, or go to the USA Pavilion website, put that into Google, and I know that they're estimating that 1 billion people are going to be engaged online on these topics. And I even remember when I was a little girl in school and I would get this weekly reader, in 4th grade, we would read and study about the World's Fair. So I think it's going to happen at all age levels, and just really encourage you to be engaged online, I would say, if you can't attend in person. Success when this theme, Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life, the sponsors are saying that theme means what you want it to mean and what it should mean, and it means so many things. And so I just look forward to new learnings and action items that will come out of Expo, either through formal channels of agreements amongst countries or informally amongst NGOs and other thought leaders of what are the steps we need to do to take to be sure that we are doing all we can to feed this population of 9 billion by 2050. So for me, success will be making sure that we get at more concrete solutions as we head to that. But so many different discussions will be taking place. And I also hope that everyone who attends comes back with learning something new about a food from a different country. And as part of diplomacy, bringing that back to their home country and sharing that new knowledge.
Any other questions? Yes, Paul.
Having been able to live abroad in Argentina and some other places, I wonder whether or not gastrodiplomacy can sometimes be a little bit aggressive from the private side. For example, I'm thinking about Starbucks. Italy's managed to not, I believe Italy's one of the few countries that still doesn't have a Starbucks, but where these vibrant cafe cultures exist. Thinking of Argentina, France, Paris, there's a Starbucks, it seems, just about everywhere. What's the tightrope that we have to walk between keeping a culture alive, like the cafe culture that exists in Paris and Buenos Aires, versus bringing the American experience, let's say, abroad?
I think that's an excellent question. I would say there definitely is, issues of this kind of encroachment on cafe cultures, this authentic cafe culture. I would say the gastrodiplomacy side of things is a little different than the private sector and the outreach of the commercial sector trying to do it in a business sense versus the gastrodiplomacy side, which is trying to be more of an educational side and a cultural sharing side. So I don't think I would call Starbucks, opening up in Argentina to be a form of gastrodiplomacy, because that's just a private commercial thing, whereas the act of gastrodiplomacy is trying to use food as a way of educating more about the nuances of the food culture. But yes, no, I think that's a very good question of where does the local authentic go when there's this encroachment from the private sector. And it's something that a lot of countries have to deal with. And I lived in Argentina as well, and would hate to see that vibrant cafe culture be, encroached upon by something that's, in the commercial sector that really just doesn't speak to Argentina the same way that the Argentine cafe culture is. I don't think I would call the private outreach, the private commercialization, to be gastrodiplomacy, but that's a longer discussion.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, we'll make this the last one because there's another panel getting ready to come in.
So going back to the authenticity question and using the example of the Korean taco, can you hear me? Yeah. And using the example of the Korean taco, for culinary creations that are made from a mixture of different cultures, which culture gets to lay claim to the creation? Or is it that no culture gets to lay claim at all?
That's a very good question. I think in some ways both cultures need to. I think there needs to be an understanding of what from each side of the cultures go into it. I don't think you could have Korean tacos without, both sides of it. It wouldn't be as interesting if it was just bulgogi, and it wouldn't be as interesting if it was just a taco. The reason why it works is because you have this fusion. I know PRI's The World was just doing a program on fusion food, which was kicked off with a look at Chinese cuisine on the Mexican border, and all of the flavors that go into that. And is a Chinese restaurant on the border as interesting as a Chinese Mexican restaurant? No, it's because we have this question of what does this look like? What does this taste like? What has gone into it? Why is what does a masala quesadilla taste like? This is something that we know. We might know the Korean food, we might know the Mexican food, but what does it look like when there's this marriage of the two? So I think there is room for credit for both of the cultures to gain from that fusion. Did you want to add anything? Okay, you, sir. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Who's the chef, please?
My short answer would be that creation is now humanity's creation, because all these talk about cultures just reminds me about boundaries, and food has no boundaries in a sense. And I would like to share some of the research, maybe at a later time, that I've done, but in essence, that is humanity's gift now, and it belongs to us. And it's knowledge that we have developed through trial and error, and I would say no one culture should take claim of it, because anybody could potentially cook that anywhere.
Johanna's pointing up. This will be the last one, I promise.
Follow up on Christina, not just because she's a fabulous former student. Which is to ask the question, make a comment, which is I think it goes back to, in political terms, back to, I equate it to the immigration experience, and we used to talk about the melting pot. And that goes back to this question of imperialism and assimilation. And if we think about it as the sort of fusion, that's one model. But another model is a pluralist model, where if we think about it of accepting, of retaining your own identity, and whether the can be an acceptance of a pluralist model, because I'm not sure how ready people are at that nationalist level in terms of diplomacy. It might be what we want in terms of peace and leading towards peace, but can we also achieve that same kind of peace in a political sense by accepting the individual identity and difference and maintaining it, and not going back to the question that was asked earlier about the hybridity? So it's a different model of fusion to suggest perhaps pluralism and acceptance of the difference identity rather than the adaptation of it.
Good point. Okay. Okay, this gentleman here, and I have to go to class. That's the only reason I'm trying to push this.
But I have to go to Zimbabwe.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here today. If you're interested in the reverse, Google what just happened in Tijuana, Mexico, where the Chinese consul general had to excuse the behavior of some of its population there. Some of the Chinese restaurants were closed down, several, because they were using dogs in their food. The consul general came out and excused it as, well, this is part of our culture. But the Mexican public, at least there in the border in Tijuana, were outraged, and there's a whole campaign. So the governor of the state, because there's a thriving Chinese population, or Chinese Mexican population, was seen 3 days after eating in a Chinese restaurant to bring that confidence. So it was an interesting, thing that just happened.
Thank you for bringing up that. I wasn't aware of that. I'll have to look into that further.
Well, I'm not Gary Weaver, but Gary had to go off to a class, and I thank him for his participation. Kim, any final words that you have? And then
Thank you for being so focused on food, and we can't wait to see what all of you are going to be doing in the years to come. So look forward to hearing about you through blogs and social media and publish academic research. Thank you.
Well, thank you for opening this day with a very fascinating set of discussions and even some controversy from the San Francisco end. I'm sure Sam is listening online. But obviously, culinary diplomacy is a part of the broader public diplomacy sphere, is something that is a growing area, not a diminishing area. And we'll hear more about some of that in our third panel this afternoon. But I want to give our panelists that remain a round of applause and in absentia those who are here. There is coffee and there are restrooms outside. There's no formal break, but we are going to set up the next panel, so don't go far because we have lots in store for you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
That was great. Oh, they're good. That's good. They work great. That's good. That's good. Yeah. Hey! I know.
I think he was just confused on maybe. Is he even on this panel? What? Is he on this panel? Mark decision. Robert Mark decision. No, I think he's the third one. Okay, I'll just tell him. I think he was unsure.
Hi. You're Nikki. Nice to meet you.
But I was just thinking, once we get all the technology out of the way, since this is down, we could either lift it or we could just put the conflict cuisine power.
Meet you. Hi. So you're going to show a film during your presentation?
No, not me.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No films.
Okay.
Hey, nice to meet you. Oh, wonderful. Oh, excellent.
Yes. What's your name?
Thank you.
Okay, so you're going to be third.
Thank you.
And so you're showing a film?
Yeah, so let me give you my email.
So it's all set up to go without technical
I wrote a
glitches,
cookbook
because
also
each
called
person has
Cuisine
only
the
8
Axis
minutes.
of Evil. Yes. And one of my favorite interviews on that cookbook was actually with Splendid Table. Yeah, I think that was probably the most political conversation she's ever had. So that was kind of funny. And I'm actually heading off to the airport. But you can easily find me. So my email, and I do not have business cards. I'm out of them. Yeah, and actually, I don't even use business cards to be frank, because I use either Twitter, Facebook. Business cards are so funny, so much, right? And then Twitter, word for word, like, he's gonna say this. No, I'm out of them. I don't think I'm gonna get new ones because there's no reason to slay a tree for business cards, right? I mean, we all have smartphones. We can all, how hard is it to type our contacts in? And then maybe for journalists, if you're gonna change.
Can you I'm pulling yours up too.
Will you eject it?
Well, let me hold on. Let me say this.
There's an 8-minute limit, so.
Yeah. So Andy could limit.
Okay, I'm saving it to the desktop. So.
So I can eject.
Hold on. Let me do it. Okay, you're good.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
I totally thought it was someone else because she pointed me to the top front row, so I don't know who I talked to there. I was like, do you have something you'd like to show? I don't know who that was.
That's fine.
Okay. Where's her video?
Video TS.
But then it's like this. If you want to run and get, let's see, maybe this. Say otherwise we can run and get Hans real quick.
Where is Hans? I never met him. I have no idea who he is. There we go.
Okay, hold on. Well, no, it's just the title. Is it?
Wouldn't it be the top one? No?
Well, okay.
Perfect. So what I'd like to
Well, I'm
do
trying to
is,
figure out.
because I want to stick to the 8-minute limit,
Yeah.
is just, say hi, and, I don't really want to introduce too much, but that I made this film, one sentence, and then let's press play.
Okay.
5 minutes in, and at about 5 minutes in, I'll be right here, so maybe you can, how do I signal to you?
I'll just keep an eye.
You'll be here?
Yeah, I can stand here if you'd like me to.
If you'll be here.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Perfect.
If you don't mind,
when did
would
that
be the
get
best.
turned on?
Okay.
Because that
This job is to be the basis of what you earn for your next job. Just keep going up. All right, sounds good. Thank you, ma'am. And where did they say the loo was? I wasn't.
Go just to the right.
All right. I'm sure if there's this, the other side of gastro diplomacy, right? Is loo diplomacy, and they never have enough loos for women. Never.
We actually worked with another Yael.
Did you?
Yeah, so I'm part of an organization called Feet in Two Worlds.
Yeah, I wanted to hear about that.
And, well, you will.
I know it will.
But she is an amazing journalist.
Great.
But she's doing
No, I thought I had more time. Yeah, I have my PowerPoint is about 15 slides. It's not going to be 8 minutes. I thought Joanna told me about
and that's how we met her, and she's been able to do some really great programming with us. She's been on
Okay.
the local NPR.
Yeah, I didn't plan to. Okay, I will adjust.
Good old Facebook.
No. Yeah. Not too far. Not too far.
I think she's also
nearby. Oh wow.
Okay, so it's
Yeah. And was she here for?
I was in Vancouver.
Oh, you were there. Excellent.
Thank you. Me too. I heard too. You guys have some Slim Peace chapters in Chicago and Boston.
Oh, yeah. The good people. Yeah, excellent. And so how long have you been at the university here?
I was dean of the school from 1986 to 2001.
Okay. And this is a new, how new is this to I think I've given a lecture in one of
Well, I mean, I will say this though, in terms of populations that are impacted, I think, especially Middle East Muslim folks, I still think that that's just an area where a lot of people come from who don't have as much access to them. And that's our that is still our if you go
Are you okay with giving your presentation from sitting down, or would you rather?
No, I think I was going to go up there.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.
So are you comfortable giving your presentation from sitting down, or
because it's also it's cross cultural.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to like shun you. Yeah, we're good. Did you have another video that you wanted me to pull up?
It's shorter. I thought, it might be better just for timing.
I'm first, right? Yeah. Oh, hi.
On schedule. We need to start the next panel. I appreciate people sitting down.
I don't mind just. Whatever's easiest for you.
And, okay. If you want to get your coffee, you're free to get up anytime and go, but I'd appreciate so we can get started. Okay, can people call people in who want to come back in for the next session? I see people talking and enjoying their coffee, which we want them to do, but we also want people to listen to the panels. Okay. I think the best part of conferences anyway is around the coffee, but okay. Okay. Okay, let's get started. I see people coming back in, the stragglers. Thank you. Just think of the reward after this, you get a great lunch. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Dean Emeritus Louis Goodman, and he will take it from here. So go ahead, Lou Goodman.
Great. Well, Johanna, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I'm just going to follow the order of the panelists that you see in your program. One change is that Andy Shalal, who's listed in the program, will not be here. And each panelist is going to have the choice of speaking from their seats or coming up to the podium. And our first panelist is Yael Lutvak, and Yael is president and CEO of Slim Peace, and she's a filmmaker. And I mentioned to each of the panelists that they have 8 minutes, which I'm going to time, and I'll wave my arms crazily when we get to 8 minutes. Yael?
Hey, no pressure. Thank you so much, Johanna, for inviting me and Slim Peace to be part of this. So I will just say that, I'm not an expert on gastro diplomacy or soft power, but I'm a filmmaker, and I made a film called Slim Peace, which was essentially bringing together Israeli and Palestinian women in a weight loss group. So I'll show you the first few minutes, and then I'll tell you the amazing epilogue that I never could have predicted. So take it away, Leighton. We're making a film, a documentary. It's about a group of women, Israeli, Palestinian, Bedouin, that are trying to lose weight.
To lose weight. We should come together to make peace. It's wonderful to be able to lose weight, but we do need to make peace.
Now, before there's an Israeli state, before the Messiah comes, this group of women, Israeli and Palestinian, can come together and lose weight.
They can do anything they want. I mean,
But do we have your blessing? Is that okay?
My blessings?
Yeah.
My blessings are always there for anybody who wishes it.
Okay.
coffee with 3 cigarettes in the morning.
It's
Two
part of the
small
menu,
cup.
3 cigarettes.
Yes, it's the menu. This is the menu. I don't eat in the morning.
Vegetable soup diet, only bread diet, only steak diet. I mean, I did every kind of diet.
Yes, many times.
Many times.
How
I
many
make
times?
diet.
How
many times?
All my life I am making diet.
Really?
Yes.
Do you eat chocolate?
Yes.
How much? And
Every
how
day.
often? How
Every
often?
day. Because everybody says, wow, you don't need to lose weight, you're skinny. And I don't think so.
Time, easy time. Okay, okay. Yeah, what I did. See some missy inside. Hassan Shefer, yalla.
Very
You see my
nice.
big ass, huh? You take it out.
So what would you like to be? You'd like to be size...
40 for me is good.
When was the last time that you felt though so happy that you didn't need to eat so much?
This is a secret, I will not tell you.
Was it a long time ago?
Yes, long time ago.
Did it have to do with love?
Yeah. This is a cheesecake.
Cheesecake?
Yes.
What is this doing here? Oh my God. Okay, this needs to go. And if we do a group of women, Israeli, Palestinian, would you be in the group?
Yes, I would like to.
And what if the group also had settlers in it? Settlers from right near here, right outside Ramallah or Hebron. What do you really think of them though?
For them?
What do you really think of them?
I don't like them.
Why?
I don't like them. They are bastards. They are settlers. They are thieves. They steal our land, and we are living in misery because of them.
The women in the group will be from Israel, Palestine, religious, and secular. How do you feel about that?
Which part? It's very intense, to think about. Like, I live in Bat Ain, and Bat Ain is extreme when it comes to Arabs, Like, no, Arabs are not allowed to come into Bat Ain.
So, sorry to cut it short, the 8 minutes. So what happened, so these women, and I'm sorry that I couldn't show you just a couple minutes more, because we brought together women who were Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, from Ramallah, as you saw, from Bat Ain, from Jerusalem, and from Beersheba, a Bedouin woman. And what happened was, at that time, Hamas was elected, Arik Sharon went into the hospital, the entire political landscape changed over the course of our filming, and the women kept coming. And they started realizing we were actually going to make a film, and they started to dress up, and they, most importantly, they met, and they heard each other's about each other's lives, and were able, through the process of a health program, to meet the other as a human being. And that process of humanization is so powerful, and people-to-people work, such as that Slim Peace does, but so many other countless organizations in the area and in other areas of conflict are so critical for that reason. because of the process of humanization. So the epilogue is that since the filming, and as a documentary filmmaker, I was all set to go, and the film premiered at Tribeca Film Festival, and I was thrilled, and it was on television in so many countries, here on the Sundance Channel. So I was all set to go and make my next film, and then a dame from England, Dame Hilary Bloom, asked me to create more groups in reality, not for the purposes of filming, and she's a dame, and she said it was my destiny, and I couldn't say no. and so I never could have predicted I'd be, sitting here talking to you and sharing with you that we've created 30 cohorts, groups of women, 20 in the Middle East, specifically in Jerusalem and in Akko, and 10 here in the U.S., Chicago, Boston, Portland, Maine, working with women primarily from Africa, Muslim women, and George Mason, and our next groups, hopefully at American University, and thrilled to share that we're going to continue our work in Jerusalem in October. So I guess it's true, you can't stop women, and I do believe it's the way forward. So if you'd like to watch the rest of the film, we'd be thrilled if you visited our website, slimpeace.org, learned about our work, and any ideas, feedback, support, so that we can continue to grow. Thanks.
So Yael, you did this in less than 8 minutes. So how long is the film if people go on the website to look at it?
Yeah, the film is, we have feature length and an hour, so for television, so it's about an hour.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let's have some applause for Yael. Our next speaker is Christine Fair, and Christine is on the faculty of our sibling school, Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and she is the author of a book called Cooking and the Axis of Evil.
Kind of. Cuisines of the Axis of Evil and Other Irritating States.
So is the irritating, is that a metaphor that is related to cooking or just politics?
Politics, but also gave me an excuse it also gave me an excuse to have 10 chapters instead of 3.
Okay, that's... you're on.
Is this on, by the way?
It's on and it's live.
Okay. Oh, so no swear words under my breath. So actually, speaking of swear words under my breath, during that last panel, so I'm a South Asianist by training. So that's Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan gets thrown in there too. And so as a South Asianist, I've been going to South Asia now my entire adult life. When I think of commensalism, there's nothing about it. I don't see the kumbaya. So when you travel to South Asia, who you eat with is going to be defined by whether you're Muslim or whether you're Hindu. Even the politics of food production, so women do most of the food cultivation, they do most of the food preparation, and this is what Hindu women and Muslim women and Christian women, virtually every woman outside of some very cosmopolitan exceptions have in common. They will prepare the food, men will eat it first, and then they will eat the leftovers, even though they have done the vast majority of the production of that food to get there. And as a foreign woman, I am often treated as an honorary male, which means I get to hang out with the women and see them toil. And by the way, they don't have the nice GMO garlics and the nice GMO tomatoes, these little itty-bitty things. And you can always see on the women's fingertips the scarring because they have this little itty-bitty garlic and this little itty-bitty onion, and they chop it like this. And so for me, food is not an opportunity for kumbaya. It actually is an opportunity to express these very primordial divisions. So I'm struck when people see the kumbaya element in food. And speaking of the kumbaya element, so Johanna asked me to talk very briefly about the motivations of this cookbook. So it came nearly out of a physical fight in a cinema in Santa Monica. My brothers had just been called up to fight in the Iraq War. I was an opponent of that war, as I think most sentient people should have been. And this woman behind me, when a Marine advertisement came on, she says, "My boyfriend's going to go kick Saddam's ass for 9/11." And I whipped my head around. I said, "Oh, no, you did not say that." And we were this close to fisticuffs. And so the palpable frustration of being against that war Because in those days, if you were considered a patriot, you could not oppose the war publicly. We began having these sort of culinary protests at my house. And I'm not a stress eater, I'm a stress cooker. And so we began having these themed dinner parties, which were really an excuse to just, micturate all over the Bush administration and how they were running and ruining our country. And so this actually... Thank you. So this was actually how I got through that war. And when my brothers came back, I finally, and after I finished my dissertation, I might add, I was finally able to write up the Axis of Evil dinner party. And what I learned was there is no editorial control when you write a cookbook. You can say anything. And so I never had so much fun as I did writing that book. And so every once in a while, there'll be like some Republican that buys it, and I'm like, I'm not sure you should do that. If our friendship means anything to you, you might just want to just leave that over there at Amazon. But as a result of doing that cookbook, I actually became quite interested in the politics of food in a very different way. And so now, we'll see what happens with my tenure decision. One way or the other, I'm going to get back to this puzzle and taking the politics of food seriously. The first thing that really struck me as I began writing this cookbook was how do these national eating cultures reflect the histories of colonialism, imperialism, militarism, be it actual conflicts, offshore basing, slavery, right? You think about food in the Caribbean, and you can't get away from the politics of slavery and indentured servitude. The politics, is literally embedded in the recipes of making these foods. And I think it's valuable. One day I hope to have a class where pick your favorite recipe from your favorite region of the world and deconstruct the politics of that recipe. So in my South Asia class, because they all think I'm a velociraptor, so to put them at ease on day one, I said, you know what, how many of you have had North Indian food? And they're like raising their hands. I said, well, what are some of the basic ingredients in those foods? Well, it's good. Your basic tadka is your tomato, your garlic, your onion. There was no such thing as North Indian food before the Portuguese rolled up, right? These are all New World foods. And so what does it mean to have indigenous Indian food? I mean, and by the way, there's a very similar debate going on right now about Christianity in India. The Hindu nationalists are going ballistic over Christians, but in fact, Christianity in India, predates Islam. And obviously there's the culinary association with that I think is really important. In the United States, our first international cuisine is really Chinese. And why is that? Because of the indentured Chinese workers that came here to build the railroads. So, ultimately, I'd like to have a class about the politics of food where we think about how are we inscribing the politics in our body by eating these cuisines and the power relations that we really don't think about anymore, but we just sort of take them for granted. I think the way in which we formalize cheap food also says something about our relations with countries. I mean, the very fact that we don't have formal empires like the French and the Brits and so forth did, but when we think about cheap food, it's almost always Mexican, right? It's only very recently that you would think of paying a lot of money for gourmet Mexican food. And I think that says something about our relationship and the way we think about Mexico. And it's almost an imperial relationship with that country. Similarly, like when you go to the Netherlands, cheap food is almost invariably Indonesian. When you go to the UK, similarly, it's invariably Indian. And then some of these foods manage to rise and become Michelin star restaurants. It's almost surprising that there's a Michelin star restaurant that's Indian in the UK. Why? Indian food was in fact invented in the UK, at least as we know it. A really great food historian has written about the invention, for example, of curry powder. So this is kind of where my interest and Johanna's interest overlap, because we're also interested in diasporas. And one thing that's always struck me, my dissertation was on the Sikh diaspora and its relationship to the Khalistan movement in the Punjab. People will lose language. I mean, many of these Punjabis I met, their Punjabi was worse than mine, but they don't lose their food. There's something really sticky about food. The idea of sort of food ghettos, I don't mean ghetto in a pejorative way, but what I mean is whole South Asian culinary physical communities where you go and it's not only you're eating, you're also socializing, you're arranging marriages, you're buying food. And then this also speaks about the economy, this sort of interconnectedness that was discussed on the previous panel. Obviously, curry powder didn't really exist. This is a construction that the Brits brought when they wanted to bring a little piece of the Raj back to their horrible food-infested island with really bad weather. But now, because many Indian women in cosmopolitan cities are actually working, they really don't have time. I mean, anyone who's cooked Indian food knows that unless you have a food processor, it can take forever, unless you have a flotilla of daughter-in-laws or cooks. And so they just don't have time for this nonsense. And so what you've seen being developed in India is not only these prepackaged curries for vegetables, for meat, or what have you, even prepackaged roti. Like breads everywhere. I think the most time-intensive things. Like I think about Ethiopian food. I wouldn't even dare to make injera. And my one time in Indian housewife boot camp, I got kicked out because my mother-in-law to be said, "What kind of woman can't make bread?" I mean, well, clearly I'm not a woman. Clearly I can't make bread. I'm still PTSD over making roti. But these are the kinds of things that they're outsourcing. And then not only are they outsourcing like the production of roti in these curry powders, they're also ending up in these diaspora and grocery stores. So you can learn a lot about India and the rearrangement of social production just by wandering into a grocery store here, because these are all products that didn't originate for the Indian American family. They actually originated from the domestic politics of production at home. And so this, the other thing that I've been really thinking about, and going back to this how do these foods become standardized? I think of cookbooks as grammars. So my training was as a South Asian languages and civilizations person. So I understand the value of dictionaries and grammars and standardizing and stabilizing a language. And over time, you can trace how a language changes by looking at these didactic tools over time, and cookbooks do the same thing. So what I've been doing while I've been working very hard to get tenure, I've been squirreling away my cookbook project, where I've been collecting, it's a transnational cookbook project over looking at post-colonial countries that all have pretty much the same thing in common, that they became independent in 1947. And I'm looking at how do these cookbooks describe healthy food? How do these cookbooks reflect foods that are available? The culinary production method says a lot about who's going to be doing that producing. So this has been a long-standing data collection process. And as soon as this tenure decision gets decided one way or the other, I'm going to get back to the cookbook project. I think that's 8 minutes. I'm going to shut up.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Fantastic. Well, our next speaker is Manolia Charlotin, or what's the right way to pronounce your last name?
In Spanish, that's actually correct.
Yeah.
But in French, it's Charlotin.
Yeah. So I'm a Spanish speaker, so I do the Spanish way, but okay, great. So Magnolia is at the New School in New York, and she's the director of the Feet in Two Worlds project, and she's going to speak from the podium.
Every time I speak, I try to honor my ancestors, so I'm going to teach you guys a little Haitian Creole since I'm from Haiti. So I usually say we greet each other in the countryside with honor and respect. And so I say honneur, and then you reply respect. So let's try it. Honneur.
Respect.
Honneur.
Respect.
It's just a little bit of culture. I wanted to bring in some of these elements. Whenever I try to speak at, especially in academia, I find myself needing to bring in a little flavor because I tend to be one of the people who look like me in the room. So my work is centered on the diaspora, in that my work is me. I'm Haitian American, born in New York City, raised in Boston, and living in between New York and Chicago now. And all the media outlets that I've run, they've been diaspora media outlets, including Feet in Two Worlds. And what's really interesting, and Christine, it's like we had a perfect segue. It's like we planned it, but we didn't. I think the spirits did. And it's essentially the politics of what happens in the home country reflect so deeply into how these diasporas then build their lives in the new country. Hence the terms feet in two worlds. And 10 years ago, John Rudolph, along with a few other colleagues who were working in public radio, decided to do a radio documentary about what it means to be a New Yorker with your feet in two worlds. And they trained an initial cohort of immigrant journalists who were from these communities to go and gather different stories that they put into a sound collage. Sorry, I'm a little close to the mic. They put into a sound collage to basically paint vignettes of folks from these different countries. Now, this seems very straightforward, that you would try to get stories from people who are of the place, right, who are from the neighborhoods, but that's not how the vast majority of our media in this country is produced, actually, especially to get into the mainstream, broader legacy media outlets. So Feed in Two Worlds was very a pioneering program in that sense. Since then, it has trained and supported over 150 immigrant journalists. So people of all walks who are either born in this country or moved when they were young were able to learn how to produce audio and video and other multimedia stories to tell stories from their communities as opposed to having their stories told for them. Now, what you're seeing here projected, and what I will share with you in a little bit, is a street vendor in New York. How many of you have been to New York City? Just about everyone in the room. Okay. So I'm Haitian, and for a long time, the word for the United States was New York City in Creole, because from the islands, because so many people migrated there, it was the first major migration center for Haitians, that they referred to that place, but it's also has its own identity as a place. It is the most international city we have, and New York is like no other place. So for me, I don't think of New York as just an American city. I think of it as a global microscope. You know, whatever you want to find, you will find in New York. Having said that, though, navigating these different communities is not necessarily easy. So if you want to get great Chinese food, you could go to Chinatown. But right now, you probably should go to Flushing in Queens, right? If you want to enjoy great Caribbean cuisine, you may think, well, there's a huge Caribbean population in Flatbush in Brooklyn, for example. But you wouldn't go there. You would go to Manhattan, or you would go to New Jersey to find some of the best. And you may decide that you want to enjoy some South Asian food, and you think, okay, I want to go, to some places in Queens, and you may find out that Long Island may be the best bet for you. And so what we did is essentially paint a landscape of the city through folks who are from the more recent immigrant populations through Feet in Two Worlds. And her face, this woman, when you think of a New York street vendor, what do you think of? I'm going to point it to young woman right here. What do you think of a New York City street vendor?
God.
Right. And young lady right here, you've been to New York? Okay, who else has been to New York? Raise your hand one more time. Okay, young woman right here. If he's a guy, what does he look like? Middle Eastern, okay. The young lady with the jacket that I like and may steal later on. You've been to New York, yes. If a street vendor, he's a guy, he may be Middle Eastern, what else could he look like? Or where else could he be from? South Asia. So the reason why I asked this question is you don't think of a woman, you don't think of a white-haired woman who could be someone's grandma or abuelita. And so I'm going to play you a video of Eliadora. She is a street vendor who is fighting to make a living on the streets of New York.
Oh, sorry.
I think you have to push the arrow.
I did.
Just needs a second to.
I think it's loading actually. Yeah. If you guys see that, it means it's loading. It'll take a little while.
It's off of Vimeo?
It's off of Vimeo.
Yeah, it just takes a little.
Well, let me set this up while it's loading. So, New York City has over 25,000 street vendors. About half of them are women. Yes. 90% of them are immigrants, recent immigrants. And one of the reasons why we did this story is because we were thinking about where we get our food as staff, in the editorial room, and we were like, oh, we have our favorite taco, our favorite arepa, we have our favorite, roti, these, and we were like, well, we haven't seen any stories done on street vendors because they're largely immigrant. And so we set out to do this big street vendor story, and we actually were lucky enough to partner with media outlets in Chicago and Oakland, and we found ourselves talking about policy and politics. I don't know why it's not playing. Let me try it one more time.
I mean, I was in some ways very non-traditional as a vendor. I was a kid from the suburbs who was born in this country and had many advantages. But I did have one thing in common there, which was a real desire to have my own business and to be my own boss. And that's something that we see across the board amongst our vendors.
Todo el mundo sabe que la economía está mal. Pues cada quien está abriendo caminitos para sobrevivir. Para mí, a mi criterio, mejor tener mi carrito de tamales. Porque lo que produzco, lo produzco para mí y no estoy produciendo para alguien que me está explotando. Imagina los sueldos que tienen en McDonald's y ellos ganan y sobreganan. Y realmente la comida, pues, a lo mejor viene siendo igual que un tamal.
So there's a proud tradition of women vending in New York City, and some famous examples. There was the Irish women called Apple Marys, and they were very famous for selling apples on the street. Even before that, there are old pictures of African American women who were some of the first vendors in the city.
Están al pendiente de su pequeño negocito y al pendiente de sus hijos. La que está embarazada, pues bueno, aún con la pancita tiene que hacer su trabajo. Tal vez somos mujeres muy fuertes o no sé, pero por la misma necesidad de querer sobrevivir, uno se las tiene que ingeniar para seguir trabajando.
So she asks a question, a rhetorical question. She says, maybe we are very strong women, but she uses the word fuerte in Spanish, which is not just about physical strength. To have fuerte means you are empowered. It means you are liberated. It means you can make your own destiny. So the word is actually very loaded. So when she uses maybe we are very strong, she means it in that way. And so what I want to explore is actually the idea of the stories of these women and the politics of the food. So what happens is the young man you saw there, he has the street vendor project. And so he has a very tough job. He has to try to help and work inside the bureaucracy of the city council, the mayor's office, to try to get more permits and try to get more support for these essentially small business owners. And because they are immigrants, there's a lot of prejudice against them. So here we are, we're in a place where New York City is the most international place in the country, and the folks who actually help make the landscape more accessible by providing cheaper, authentic foods from their homelands and actually help shape the vibrancy and the energy of the city's streets. They have to fight the policy and the politics of that because several mayors, all the way back to LaGuardia, they saw them as a nuisance. Even though when you think of New York City, you think of street food. I don't care if you're coming from Uptown, Spanish Harlem, from El Barrio, all the way down to Staten Island, you think of street food. And so I wanted to present this in terms of where policy, where public policy impacts food production on the local level. If you think about it very internationally, but I think on the local level, it's playing out. It starts at home. So what you do or how you are shaped from the many cities and or towns that you are from in the United States is going to shape what you do around the world. So if you come from a place where the people who look different and who speak different languages, who add cultural vibrancy to your home is not supported, consistently confronting barriers to add to the cultural fabric, then it's going to impact our foreign policy. And being raised in Boston, we have a very famous expression from a very famous politician, from Tip. All politics are local. And so when we think about foreign policy, what I would urge many of you, folks who actually are of an American background, to think about how does that start from the city or rural town that you live in here? How are people who are from different parts of the world, who have their feet in two worlds, what kind of barriers are they confronting? And also, too, what do they even have restaurants? I think a lot of times, especially with some of the older immigrant populations, we think of folks having restaurants as a way for them to, as cultural arbiters, cultural ambassadors of their cuisine. When really a lot of immigrants, and I can speak of the more recent folks in the last 30 years, they actually have restaurants because they need to make a living. And in restaurants, in terms of do they build, I want to answer the large question of the panel as, does food, is food a place for peace and conflict or conflict? Overwhelmingly, I would say yes. Because at any local bodega, you will find many different places of culture. You will find some curry powder. You may find a packaged roti. You may find a packaged Maggi, which is used in a lot of Latin and Caribbean cuisines. So it's a place where you can actually go and find bits of the world, right? But the restaurants, not only are they a place for that, but they're also a place of shared interests. So soccer, when you think about where people watch soccer, they watch it mostly in immigrant restaurants. So who's watching soccer? Folks from all walks of life, right? Let's say you walk into a space and it's mostly Africans there. You may find folks from West Africa, East Africa, completely different religion, completely different socioeconomic background, but they love soccer. But the soccer turns into politics every single time. So the food is never separated from the human experience, and the human experience that has led many of these folks who are creating this wonderful food that we love in these cities. They're there because of politics and the policies from either their homelands and or the ones in the place that they've adopted in their home. So I want you guys to think next time you walk into a restaurant, especially the smaller ones that seem like it's from more recent populations. So you walk into an Eritrean place, not some of the Italian or Greeks, folks who've been here for a while, but some of the more recent folks, East African, West African. Think about why the restaurant is there, who owns it, who is patronizing it, what else is happening other than the eating, right? As a place of gathering, not just a place to go enjoy someone else's culture. It's a place to actually go experience a little slice of life of that person and their homeland. Thank you.
Manolia, thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to our last speaker prior to questions, and that's Roger Mark de Sousa. And Roger Mark is going to speak also from the podium.
Thank you very much. So I think from Yael, we heard stories about humanity, from Christine about the politics of food, and from Manolia, the importance of stories. And I think Manolia, the spirits are aligned because I am also from the Caribbean. I am from Trinidad and Tobago and grew up eating West Indian, East Indian food. Christine, that's how we refer to our Indian food in Trinidad. I'd like to take this, my comments in a slightly broader perspective to talk a little bit about what this means for some of the points that Manolia raised with regard to public policy and foreign policy. So I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Some of you may be familiar with us. We're part of the Smithsonian, established by Congress in the name of Woodrow Wilson, the only president to have a PhD thus far. And we very much focus on bringing together the worlds of analysis and research with policy and practitioners, really very practical application. And I want to talk a little bit about how we have been looking at these questions around food and conflict and cooperation and what it means. And we, let's see. I want to talk a little bit about an initial meeting that we convened with a number of folks who were being funded by USAID doing international development work. And we were trying to get a sense of what are the connections between food insecurity, and conflict, and how those issues came together. And we brought together some of the leading programs that are applying interventions in specific hotspot areas to think about how these issues were connected. So we wanted to think about how we position food and conflict together. Does conflict affect food security and vice versa? How do we define conflict and the risk of conflict? What do we know in terms of so-called food wars, violence, to post-conflict recovery, and what types of interventions are being provided? What is working, what is not working? And we realized that as a community, we really hadn't examined these questions in a very systematic way, and policies and programs were being applied independently without a really sophisticated analysis of how these areas came together. And we know when we think of the rapid increases in food prices for grain starting in 2008, that it led to civil unrest in more than 40 countries. And this did not all lead to really intrastate and intrastate conflict, but we know that there were a lot of uprisings, and sometimes you look at the headlines, and some of my colleagues would say that you're writing a press release on this, and it's not sexy enough. You need to say food riots spur conflict, and it's not fully accurate. We say we have to be very, very careful and very measured. It's a very nuanced relationship. There are a number of variables that come into play. So what is the spark that gets people to rebel, and how does that lead into conflict? Part of it is the food prices and the volatility of those food prices, but part of it are questions around population dynamics and demography, urbanization, where food is not being produced. Globally, we're more than 50% urban. What does that mean for safety nets in urban areas in some predominantly urban countries? And what does it mean? This last graph on the bottom right shows individual food production. And the line, that's the flattest line there, shows that there's actually very little production happening on a per capita basis. So when you look at this from different scales, there's a very small safety net at the level of the individual and per capita food production. And these issues all come together in some way to spark conflicts around food. So it's not just food price volatility. It's a number of factors coming together that have an important aspect. One of the issues that we very often talk about in looking at the Arab Spring was the question of subsidies, and recognizing that for the Middle East, when there were reduced subsidies for bread, that it really contributed to a lot of the outbreaks that we saw happening, but there were a lot of questions associated with governance. And very often we look at what's the role of governance in these so-called food conflicts. And we also recognize that there are certain situations where we know that food and questions around food are very much an instrument of war, and there's very active destruction of food and food supplies. So we also look at that and think about what that means. We try to get a sense of what do we know. We looked at the data around these issues, the hypotheses, how people are examining these issues, and what are some of the interventions. And what we found was very often there's a lot of very good data on conflict, and there's very good data on food and food insecurity, and never do the two come together. Okay, so we have very good data and information and data sets. The connection and overlaying of those data does not systematically happen. There's a lot of very good theory and hypotheses examining these fields in isolation, and we found that the theory on conflict is actually a bit stronger than the theory that we have on food security. And we discovered that there were a large number of interventions taking place in hotspot areas, coming particularly from the development community. The other question that we tried to get a sense of was how does conflict affect food security? And we were able to determine that it affects food security in all of the dimensions. So this is captured in a report that we produced. It's called Harvesting Peace. I have a copy of it here, but it's also available online, and I'm happy to provide the reference for that. But we see that conflict affects food security in terms of availability, access, utilization, and stability and certainty of food flows. It invariably leads to increased food insecurity, and one factor that is very often missed is looking at both the short-term and long-term effects. So a lot of longitudinal studies have looked at the health impacts on young children. So young children who grew up in these communities of conflict, fragile states where they were deprived of food, research has demonstrated that 20 years later that their cognitive abilities, their earning capacity, and their intellectual capacities have been severely diminished for life. So there's some of these long-term effects that the development community is trying to have a sense of what this means and how can they intervene. We know that when we look at food insecurity and food insecurity's contributions to conflict, that it triggers conflict responses. I think we saw some of the images that referred to that earlier. It also catalyzes action, and that action, people are moved to act, particularly when there's competition over scarce natural resources, particularly around water and arable land. So those are the two areas where we see that food security tying to natural resources leading to conflict. Very often building a momentum towards engagement. There's situations of conflict tied to food where there's political leadership that emerges, and very often you see these political leaders capitalizing on that social political capital in other spheres. So it's a very, very interesting phenomenon. One of the phenomenon that we also looked at was how does it provide incentives to support and engagement in other sectors, particularly around grievances and questions around injustice. So folks are motivated to act. Communities are motivated to act. And there are lots of situations where we see that there's also, it sustains conflict, particularly for those segments of the community where they have a sense that they will not lose anything. So those of us who look at this from a demographic lens very often talk about age structure and young men in these communities who say, listen, I have nothing to lose. I'm starving. I'm just going to go for it. Let's rebel, let's revolt. So that's another dimension that we try to have a sense of. And this was fascinating when we did this work. So we work with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, and we also work with USAID's Feed the Future initiative. So these are our two major initiatives coming through the government that's looking at how you deal with conflict and how you deal with food insecurity and what it means to development. And we presented these results to both of them, both coming from USAID. We sat them down in a room and we were introducing them to each other. They said, we never speak to each other. As my son would say, Nadoy. Yeah, we should be thinking about how the architecture posture and how we make decisions around conflict resolution and peace building should feed into Feed Your Futures initiatives and vice versa. So this was an opportunity for some dialogue and consideration and learning in this area that we hope will infuse this community. And we see that those coming in from a humanitarian perspective very often will go into areas of conflict to feed the hungry, regardless of the conflict. That is their mantra. So we see that happening. There's a very important focus on rebuilding and restructuring institutions of governance. And this is something that we also see the military providing some assistance for. So we see the development community, the humanitarian community, and the military coming together in this kind of help. Ultimately, there's a greater recognition that this needs to be happening at the level of households, helping households recover. And I think, as Manolia reminded us, that there's an opportunity to think about what works at a local level, what works locally, and that involves engaging civil society and bringing on the private sector and understanding what's going on in a local context. So this body of work that we did initially was very interesting, fascinating. And just last week, we took this work to another level in working with the G7. So Germany is about to take over the presidency, to assume the presidency of the G7. And so the German Foreign Office came to us and said, listen, we need to figure out what are the connections between climate, fragile states, conflict, and a number of development interventions, including food. Can you, the Wilson Center, work with some of our European colleagues, coordinating with the State Department and USAID, and map this out for the G7 foreign offices? So we worked on this report with a number of partners, and we released it last week. It was discussed at the G7 foreign ministers meeting last week, and we talked about 7 sets of compound risks around local resource competition, livelihood insecurity, extreme weather events, transboundary water management, sea level rise, and unintended effects of climate policies, something that we call maladaptation. So we're looking at this from a climate lens. We're looking at fragility and conflict. And the 7th one that we identified, it wasn't number 7, I put it as number 7 for the purposes today, was looking at volatile food prices and provision. So we're making the connection between climate change impacts, instability, fragility, food production, and what it means for overall development. We're positioning this with the G7 foreign ministers who are setting this as an overall development and foreign assistance policies across the G7. So, and what we have done in presenting this to the G7 to say, listen, there are a number of very systematic gaps that we continue to see in the policy arena. We're seeing it in climate change adaptation. These communities are not coming together, both in terms of practical application, but in financing mechanisms. Development and humanitarian aid are not collaborating enough, and peace-building communities are not bringing these questions into play in a very systematic way. So we produce a number of recommendations around this that the G7 is now just appointed a working group to examine, looking at climate fragility risk, cooperation among the G7 members, looking at multilateral processes, and looking at global action around resilience. But we specifically are pushing them for action in 5 key areas to build resilience against climate fragility risks. So it's looking at what are the risk assessments, what does it mean for disasters, what does it mean for transboundary water, how do you build local resilience, and food security, specifically looking at how you develop resilient food systems in the context of a world that's being changed by climate. And what does this mean for human well-being? What does it mean for development? What does it mean for foreign policy, for humanitarian assistance, and also military engagement? So that's a little bit of that perspective, and this new report is called A New Climate for Peace, and the G7 is now taking that up now. So that's a little bit of the framing and how this is being examined from a public policy and a foreign policy perspective. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much for your presentation. Now we have an opportunity for questions from the floor, and I think we need a microphone to go with the questioners. And first, this young woman on the left, and then after her, this young woman in the front, and then this young woman on the side, and we'll go with those first three. And
Hi, as a Californian and an environmental science major, I'm thinking constantly about the drought on the West Coast, and a lot of people are saying that this could be the beginning of a 30-year mega drought. And my question's for Mark. I was just wondering if the Wilson Center has done any research on what sort of consequences we might see in our own country in terms of the imminent food shortage that's going to happen in California.
so since we have 15 minutes, hold your answer, Mark. Let's have three questions. Next to Susan in front.
Thank you, and thank you for streaming it. I was watching this morning, so I've been engaged all morning. It's been a wonderful panel and event so far. Also, to the last speaker, I noticed that the solutions that were recommended on food security were primarily better market information, and I wonder if for food security, I wonder if there are ways that are more about developing food production and agricultural inputs that are on the table as well. Thank you.
And the third question in the set, this woman in the black.
I'd be really interested to know the genesis of Slim Peace. It's a fascinating concept.
Okay, Mark, you want to lead off with answering those two questions?
Sure, thank you very much. So we at the Wilson Center, our mission is on international development and international engagement. So we're not specifically looking at these issues as they relate to the United States. But we do bring in our partners who are working on analyzing these issues from a U.S. perspective. I'll tell you some of the reaction that I've gotten, though. So we do a lot of work, for example, looking at the drought in the Sahel and what that means. The questions that I get from U.S. journalists or policymakers as we do that work is, what will that mean for us in the United States? And there's very often a concern that there will be people who are environmentally displaced because of these issues, and that then they would be coming to the United States. So that gets us into another a different policy realm entirely. I would say we have been working with a number of partners in the security community and the military community who are looking at these issues in terms of their engagement overseas, but what it means for their installations within the United States. So not specifically on drought, but they're looking at climate change and what it means for military installations and the demands that is being put on them. We're also finding increasingly I hope everything's okay. Yes. We're also finding increasingly that there is a desire for more collaboration between organizations and local government in the United States with international partners to learn. Just a performance upstairs. There we go. That's reassuring. Very effective. So there's attempt to collaborate and look at what's happening overseas and to see how they're dealing with drought and what it might mean for us. So there's that kind of partnership. On the question on food production and agricultural inputs, most definitely the recommendations that I had put up there were recommendations to the foreign ministries of the G7. So, and that's sort of the high level recommendations. As they get down on a lower scale, there are questions around production and inputs, most definitely.
Yael, do you have an answer to the?
Yes. So thanks for the question. The genesis of the film came from my own life, very personal, both as someone who, I was born in Jerusalem, but I grew up in the U.S., and so I always had a very strong connection to the Middle East, and specifically to Jerusalem. And also, I am a woman who always also struggled with my own body image and weight and health. And I was living in Israel, and I was living in Tel Aviv, and I was in a Weight Watchers meeting, and it was at the same time that the peace process broke down again in 2001, and I was in this Weight Watchers meeting, and I was hearing the women in the group, and they were sharing so much humanity and emotion. And one woman was talking about how she struggled so much with her health and her weight and her life, and there was immediately empathy in the room. And then it quickly turned, because another woman talked about how she had gone with her husband, and there was buffets at every meal, there was some hotel, and how she was able to maintain eating healthily. And then everyone started to cheer. So there was so much emotion in that room, and I thought, well, what if we could capture that emotion and humanity and bring together women who would normally never meet? And that's what we did. And it was, a crazy idea, obviously. And, I was, we didn't know how people would react. Also, we got some pushback. Are we normalizing relations? Are we not seeing? But actually, we just did take, in some ways, the politics as much as possible out of it and bring it down to the human level, which everyone here has spoken about, and the importance of just keeping it simple. As David Mamet said, keep it simple, stupid. And what was extraordinary, and I am really keen to talk to you after, because the data that we have seen from our formative evaluations is nothing short of extraordinary, because the women continued to come despite, and I have to admit, hearing that scream, I still probably have PTSD from living in Israel for so many years and in Palestine. So we had 3 terrorist attacks when we had these meetings right outside of the meeting, and everyone kept coming. We had Gaza 1, they kept coming. We had Gaza 2, they kept coming. And even now, there's no hope in the region. We got funding last night with Notre Dame, in partnership with Notre Dame. Fantastic woman is going to go, and we're going to restart our work there in October.
Well, congratulations.
The genesis is personal, but it's not really me. It's just the testament of people needing hope.
So let's do our next set of questions. The young lady in the back with the black jacket. And then the young lady with the red shirt.
Okay.
And a third person. If there's no third person, I'll ask the question. Adelante.
All right, thank you. I think my question is to Christine. You mentioned something that really spoke to me. You said you don't believe in the kumbaya. Food is about the primordial motivations. I wrote it down.
I have a bad ear. Can you speak into the microphone?
Sure.
Sorry.
So you mentioned the primordial motivations of food. And we've been talking about gastrodiplomacy and peace and conflict. But food is also a source of conflict when it's about authenticity, right? And there are a lot of, and hummus was mentioned, and there are many other examples like that. So how can we overcome that, right? I mean, how do we go from fighting over whose food it is, right? And why should I accept it as yours or as something that's shared, which we all, I think, here would agree that it's something that's shared, to the point where we go to breaking the same bread and saying that, yes, it's our common bread. Is it possible at all, or is it just another facet of a conflict that already exists, right? And so it's manifested in the food or around the table, whether it's hummus, whether it's dolma, whether it's even, lokum or Turkish delight. So thank you.
The woman with the red shirt.
Sure. Thank you for this great discussion. My question is for Manolia. Prior to coming to DC to become part of the American Food History Project at the Smithsonian, I was a cookbook editor in New York working with a street vendor, a food truck that is now out of business. And one of the comments that he made to me working on his book was that you didn't see real crackdowns on street vendors in New York City until white people running more profitable food vending ventures started getting lots of media coverage by mainstream food media. And of course, what happened when you saw even smaller scale immigrant ventures like the pupusa stands at the Red Hook ball fields get that press coverage is that the Department of Health goes out and starts putting really restrictive limitations on all of these different ventures, which some people can adhere to and some businesses fold because they simply can't afford to change the way they do business. So my question to you is, in your research, how much of what you've learned from these immigrants with one foot in the US and one foot in another, how much of their food cultures can they sustain given that the policies don't allow for much flexibility?
And the third question, Johanna, you had your hand up?
Well, I want to thank all the panelists too, but I have a question that all of your comments have raised, and that is the initial question of whether food can be a tool in peace building, and obviously what Roger Mark has described as some of the liabilities of food as both a tool of reconciliation but peace building. But as a field, since two of you are academics and two of you are in the media business, what is your sense of getting these two themes, food and conflict, into the mainstream of discussion? Because obviously the food becomes an important cultural vehicle, it becomes an important point of entry